In the ward of the maternity hospital, young mom Marion was recovering from surgery. A few days ago, she had given birth to triplets. The operation was planned, a little bit before the due date. Doctors decided not to risk it, as the woman had contractions, and for natural childbirth she had direct contraindications. The babies were still under the doctor's care. All three were girls. Marion tried to lactate, but her breasts hurt. It was getting tight. The nurse actively helped, taught her how to use a vacuum breast pump, and reassured her, "Don't panic. This agony won't last long. It's just that you are still on antibiotics today. It's better to pump. I think tomorrow the doctor will allow you to breastfeed. And your triplets will quickly develop your breasts, and everything will be fine. You just have to be patient." She tried, writhing in pain and asking questions. "Will I get my babies tomorrow, or can I see them today?" They were so hard for me. "You won't believe it. I slept for a few hours before the birth, and only on my right side. I could hardly walk at all. I couldn't see my way around my huge belly. And what kind of football matches they were organizing inside me. My husband kept laughing that my stomach was going round and round, but I didn't have time to laugh. It's easy now. And how I was afraid of childbirth, I can't tell you. My sister died after the operation when I was still a baby, and I was terrified of having a cesarean. I thought I was going to die like her. It's a good thing everything went well. I can't believe it. I'm just afraid of how I'm going to cope with three at once. It's like a panic." The nurse smiled. "Yeah, it's hard. It's never easy. This is the fourth case in our maternity hospital in my entire practice. But you are married, so your husband will help you. I'm sure there are grandmothers, so get the whole family involved. It just seems like you can't handle it. And when the girls grow up, on the contrary, it will be easier. The three of them will have fun. They'll develop faster than their peers. And by the way, we're allowed to stay with the woman in labor. So have a happy daddy come to you tomorrow." Marion looked sad. "Yes, you see, he's on a long overseas trip. He has an important contract. He's been waiting so long for it, but he calls me all the time. And I have a very complicated relationship with my mother-in-law. It's long to explain, but I hope that when she hugs her granddaughter, she'll soften up. And my mom's dead. So it's a little sad that no one's coming. But nothing. Tomorrow I'll start feeding the babies, and the mood will lift. Yes, it's a difficult situation you're in. Then I'll ask Oscar tomorrow. He'll be on shift. He'll help you with the kids. This guy is amazing. Even though he's an orderly, he'd make a great doctor. And he's a wonderful person. You're going to need some help at first, especially since they're moving the kids to your room tomorrow. And you can't do any heavy lifting for a while so the stitches don't come apart. Well, I think we've done it. I'm going to run. Don't be sad." Marion sighed. The most important thing is that the babies are healthy. Thinking of them and herself, and while she had the chance, Marion didn't think about going to bed. She kept dialing her husband's number. She wanted him so much to be near her, to embrace her, to see the children. Cattle took the call and grumbled unhappily. "I'm in a meeting, very busy, if it's nothing urgent. I'll call you later." Marion was even offended by such aloofness and coldness. He said it as if the birth of babies, such a small thing, a common thing. He didn't even ask about the babies or her health, as if he didn't care. And her mother-in-law didn't come to see her. It was good that Marion had prepared everything necessary for the maternity hospital in advance, and there was a small amount of money in her purse. She wanted something tasty, not just hospital food. The woman could barely make it to the bed, as her stomach was pulling hard. Marion looked out and saw a man wearing a funny red hat and wide, short cotton plaid trousers. He was jumping up and waving at someone, sending air kisses and shouting like a madman. Willis. I'm coming tomorrow. I love you. My mom's making dumplings with cottage cheese like you like. Thank you for my son." A burly woman leaned out of the window, showed her husband her fist, and waved her hands. "Bill, why are you yelling at the whole world? I'm having my third child, and you're still jumping around like a boy. Go on, you wretch, and take care of Jessica. Make sure they eat well, don't feed them quick noodles, and put on a scarf, you'll catch a cold." Marion even cried. It was so touching. Simple words, but so much care for each other between the spouses. It was as if they had forgotten everything, and it was so bitter and hurtful. The woman fell on the pillows, wanted to take a nap, but sad thoughts did not give her peace. Happy memories of the past and anxiety, fear for her future. Everything was mixed up. I was born and raised in the most ordinary family. My dad was a chauffeur, my mom was a postman. We lived poorly. Money was always in short supply. I loved my dad very much. I couldn't get enough of him. I was always waiting for him at the window after work. He was very kind, called me a gnome and rocked me on his lap. But he and my mom didn't get along. Quarrels were a frequent occurrence. Mom reproached my father for not earning enough. Daughter cried when parents fought, and often heard the frightening and incomprehensible word divorce. Her mother also kept shouting that her father was being taken away by some mistress. It seemed to little Marion that it was some evil bird of prey that wanted to take Daddy away. But she believed that Daddy would never leave her. But one day, that's exactly what happened. Daddy left quietly, literally in the early morning, to the door with the huge suitcase. But Marion heard him, jumped out of bed and ran after him barefoot, clinging to his trouser leg and begging. "Daddy, don't leave me, don't go away. I love you, stay. Take me with you." But he only lifted her in his arms, hugged her tightly, wiped away her tears in farewell, and replied, "I can't, my favorite gnome, I'm sorry. You do not cry, I will call you and visit you." But Marion would not listen to anything. She sobbed and thrashed in hysterics, until her strict mother dragged her away and shouted, "Don't grovel, daughter. Let him go to his nurse, we can live without him," and slammed the door shut without regret. And Marion had ever since harbored a mortal grudge against her father. She did not understand how it was possible to betray a child, to exchange him for another woman. Mom became very withdrawn after her father left. She was often irritated and vented her negativity on her daughter. She started giving up, getting sick. They were barely making ends meet. That's why Marion, even as a teenager, got a job at an animal shelter to clean up after them, feed them, do small errands, give affection and love to the pets. Looking into the eyes of abandoned kittens and puppies, she saw herself in them. The money paid was not much, but there was enough for pocket money and food. Mom began to drink and sank lower and lower. Marion couldn't get through to her. She couldn't stand it and moved to another town. She got a job as a shop clerk. Her experience in animal care came in handy. She was happy to advise customers. She was praised for her responsiveness. It was at work that Marion met Scott. He came to her for medication for the service dog. The girl not only consulted him, but also volunteered to examine the pet, gave him shots. That's how they became friends. Marion liked the guy very much. He was already working as a supervisor in the security organization that belonged to his parents. And Scott was a good-looking guy. He went to the gym, looked after himself, dressed expensively. At first, Marion was very complex. She realized that against his background, she looked like Cinderella, the same small, fragile, modestly dressed. But the groom, as if it did not notice it, gave her gorgeous bouquets, took her to concerts, piled fashionable clothes, and called her a princess. Scott really fell in love. He'd always liked petite girls. He was like a hunter luring Marion into his net, and he was so excited about it. The girl was in love, too, catching every word Scott said and waiting anxiously for the next date. But she didn't lose her head. It didn't go any further than hot kisses and hugs. She decided that if a guy really loved her, he would propose marriage, and all they will still have, and hot nights, and children, and there was no need to hurry. Cattle was angry at the bride's stubbornness and excited at the same time. Perhaps it was his lust for her that drove him to marry her. He loved everything fancy, so he approached this issue with a big deal. He booked a trip on a yacht to the sea, and there gave the bride a ring, saying that he intends to marry. Marion was happy, and even the fact that she received her mother-in-law on the bayonet, the girl did not stop. Marion believed that the most important thing was that Scott loved her. It was only their life, and they would build it themselves. The wedding was also gorgeous. A lot of guests, live music, contests. The bride was very afraid that Scott would insist that they live with his mom, but fortunately this did not happen. Parents long ago bought him a flat in a bedroom neighborhood. There the young people began to live after the wedding. The first year everything was like a fairy tale. Marion literally melted from the love and affection of her husband. All their free time they spent together. She tried to be a good hostess, pampered his favorite home cooking, gave messages, and waited in every possible way. But over time Scott got used to everything. He no longer praised his wife for her efforts and admired her, and his mother continued to nag him. After his visits to her, he always arrived irritated, and another quarrel broke out in the family. Marion was very happy about the pregnancy, and Scott didn't mind either. But not until they went to the ultrasound together. And when they were told that there would be triplets, everyone was shocked. Marion herself was very scared. At her small height and weight, it seemed unrealistic to carry 3 children at once. The cattle became taciturn. He was not happy about the prospect of changing nappies day and night and listening to 3 babies at once. And Mrs. Rachel was going mad. She kept saying that no one in their family had ever had more than 1 child, and taunted her son that her wife had fathered children. She even insisted on an intrauterine examination to find out the truth. Marion flatly refused. It was very dangerous. After all, the pregnancy was already difficult. Why take such a risk? The cattle was torn internally. He showed tenderness and care, and then on the contrary, he threw tantrums and became aggressive. He brought Marion to tears with his reproaches, saying that she had become like a balloon, no waist, no figure, and her face was all blotchy. He came late. They went out together less and less often. Her husband became as if embarrassed of her. At 7 months, he announced that he had an important contract and was going on a long business trip for 6 months. Marion was happy for her husband, but at the same time she was so scared to be alone. At first he even called, they talked for a long time, sent money. And now, when the babies were born, he could not pick up the phone at all. It really worried Marion. She was panicking. The woman hoped that at least her mother-in-law would come to her senses and help her, but she was not seen in the maternity hospital. The next day, the babies were moved to their mom's room. Marion never left their side for a minute. She took turns holding them, rocking them. The nurse Oscar taught her everything. He handled the babies so cleverly, showed them how to change nappies properly, how to take care of the umbilical cord and eyes. Together they washed the babies. The woman admired. "Oscar, how great is your work. It's strange that you work as an orderly. You are a born doctor." The man replied sadly, "And I am a doctor. I worked at the ambulance. But there was such a story. I made a fatal mistake and did not save a patient once, and something broke in me. I decided to leave the substation myself while I'm working as an orderly, and then we'll see. I don't think I have the right to be responsible for patients' lives anymore. Don't worry, you'll be fine. I'll help you while you're here, and then you'll learn. What are you going to name the babies? Have you decided yet?" Marion smiled and replied, I've decided on Angelina, Amelia, and Veronica. I just haven't consulted my husband. He's always busy. But I think you won't mind. I wish he'd come back. Or at least my mother-in-law. We have to discuss everything and buy everything for the kids. We didn't do it beforehand. It's bad luck. Do you know when I'll be discharged? Oscar replied. Usually after the operation you are discharged in a week, if there are no complications. But remember, you can't lift weights, so take care of yourself. You can't take 2 babies in your arms at once. It was getting close to discharge. Marion was getting more and more nervous. Her husband didn't answer her calls. How would she get home alone with the babies? Who would help her with the kids? So when the young mum saw her mother-in-law entering the room, she was very happy. Marion began to count. Hello, Mrs. Rachel. It's so good to see you. It's Scott who's not answering his phone for some reason. And tomorrow is discharge day. I'll introduce you to my granddaughters. This is Amelia, this is Angelina, and this is Veronica. She looks the most like Scott, doesn't she? But her mother-in-law gave her an unkind look. Didn't even look at the children, and interrupted Marion abruptly. Then gave her a look that made her hair stand on end in horror. Stop pretending and put the child down. Listen to me. The cattle divorced you, and I've got the document right here. Read it. We'll never recognize children, you know that. And don't you dare take our name when you fill in the father's name. Also, Scott's not on a business trip. He's got another family, and there's no place for you there. It was clear from the start that your marriage wasn't going to last. Your things will be here tomorrow. I hope you realize that what you came to us in, you'll leave in. Marion was as if in a stupor. She kept looking at the document. It was a certificate of dissolution of marriage, and there was her signature on it. How can this be? We never thought of getting divorced before that business trip of his. It's a forgery. Mrs. Rachel laughed and remarked with a sneer. You have to look at what you sign, and preferably read it too. I've said it all. I hope you disappear from our lives forever. Dogs, pussycats, poor people, a bunch of kids, that's your calling. That's all you're good for, so get on with them. Mrs. Rachel left, slamming the door. Marion burst into tears. The children, as if sensing her condition, began to cry all at once. She had no way of quieting them. Her mind was in a turmoil. Half an hour later, the whole hospital heard the screams of the children. The nurse came first, followed by Oscar. They saw that the woman was mad. She took turns shaking the babies, walking back and forth with them in the room and sobbing. Even through her dressing gown, you could see that it was soaked with blood. The nurse snatched the babies from her and almost forcibly put her to bed. She started scolding her. Marion, what are you doing? You're not supposed to be lifting weights or running around, and the child is not a doll to be thrown with such force. Are you out of your mind? The woman sobbed and screamed without remembering herself. Yes, I am. I'm thinking of jumping out of the window or something worse. My mother-in-law has just informed me that my husband has another family and he has already divorced me, and they don't recognize children. How can I be alone with them? Should I leave them here? Since their father doesn't need them and their mother has nowhere to go, nowhere. And nothing to live on. Mom sold everything, even our shabby Khrushchevka flat, and she died. And I have no husband now. I have nothing but screaming children. How can I not go mad here? The young mother became really hysterical. The nurse had to inject her with a sedative and whispered to Oscar, "It's bad. She's got postnatal depression from the shock. I don't want her to give up the babies. Let her sleep and I'll go and get the doctor. She's in a really bad place. I don't know. Maybe we should call a crisis center. There are some centers where they take women in to live temporarily." What a bastard of a man. That's what I'm talking about. His wife bore and gave birth to his triplets, and he ran away to another woman. A decision instantly ripened in Oscar's mind. He grabbed the nurse's arm. "Don't go anywhere, please. I'll take the patient back to my place. I won't let her do anything stupid or they'll make a fuss. That poor woman would be in a lot of trouble." Gloria looked admiringly at the orderly. "Oscar, are you serious now? You're a hero. Well done. No one from our ward would dare to do such a thing. Okay, she'll wake up and we'll see what's going on. Maybe it's just her first reaction." Marion slept for a short time and returned to the terrible reality. Her head felt heavy and tears came to her eyes again. She couldn't believe that she had been so meanly abandoned by her nearest and dearest, and she was scared what to do next. The children whimpered. Marion began to feed them. Amelia was trying so hard, sucking so hard, smacking her breast funny, and immediately all bad thoughts were dispelled. Such a wave of tenderness came over the woman, and she realized that she could not leave her children. She could not live without them. She would not act like her father. The girls ate enough and fell asleep again, smiling. Oscar came quietly into the room and saw that Mummy had recovered a little. He sat down on a chair and made up his mind. "Marion, listen to me and don't interrupt me. I've made up my mind, and I've even spoken to Mummy on the phone. I'll take you and the children to my place tomorrow. You'll live with me. And that's out of the question. You're post-op, and you're not going to be able to do anything without help. Don't get the wrong idea. I'm just helping you out as a human being. I was on the verge not so long ago. I didn't want to live. I barely got out of depression. So I understand how you feel. Don't refuse, or I'll take offense, I promise. It's the only way out of your dead-end situation. We'll get through this together. I'll help you. I see you're a normal, decent woman. You've had some bad luck with your husband, but you mustn't despair, and you mustn't be nervous, or you'll lose your milk. So good night. Rest until tomorrow. Everything will be all right, you'll see." Marion cried again, but now with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, Oscar. You are simply my savior. But I'm so embarrassed falling on your head. I'll be in the way. Babies cry at night." The man smiled. "I live with my mum, and she's the kindest person I know. She won't mind. Don't be shy with us at all. Also, let's use the first name. It's kind of funny. Rest while the kids are asleep. Seize the moment. I won't let you do anything stupid. Things will work out. You just have to wait." Scott was lying on the seaside sipping a cocktail. His lover, Jeanette, a diplomat's daughter and socialite, was dozing next to him. So far, their stormy affair was secret, but Jeanette was getting more and more cranky and demanded a divorce. Then came a call from her mother. "Hello, my son. Do you know what your wife has done? She signed the divorce document and said she doesn't want to live with you anymore. She also said the kids have nothing to do with you. I saw them. They're not our breed. What an ingrate. We took her into a decent family without a penny, and she turned her nose up at us." Cattle was even relieved. He did not want to return home, to take his wife from the maternity hospital, and the prospect of raising children did not please him at all. So he answered cheerfully, "Is that so? Well and good. That's one less thing to worry about. Now I can meet Jeanette officially without any secrets. She's a tigress, a goddess. Thank you, Mom, for the good news. You were right as always. Marion and I were a mistake. It's only now that I realize I didn't love her at all. It was more of an obsession." Mrs. Rachel exulted. Her plan had worked. She was finally rid of Marion, and legally. The naive fool had signed the divorce papers a month ago without looking, thinking she was signing a power of attorney. But the son was not against it at all. He has long weighed these relations, and the unexpected pregnancy had only pushed her son towards this decision. Mrs. Rachel had decided long ago, when her son first brought the saleswoman home, that she would do anything to keep them apart. So she took a risk and had a heart-to-heart talk with Jeanette, promising her that if she could get her son away from his wife and away from the family, the woman's business would become their family business. Mrs. Rachel had calculated everything, knew that Jeanette had long liked her son. She had been a member of the family since high school, from a decent family, a perfect candidate for the role of daughter-in-law. Jeanette did not have a permanent suitor at that time. She was frankly bored and took this strange proposal as a challenge and an interesting game. And she got down to business, got a job in the company of Mrs. Rachel, and began to apply her charms. Her figure was excellent. She knew how to present herself, so it was easy to seduce Scott. Jeanette didn't give a damn about his wife. She never cared about other people's grief. Her father had raised her in luxury, indulging her every whim, and she was used to achieving her goals at any cost, especially since she really liked the boy. Marion was still hoping for a miracle before she was discharged, and she was dialing her husband like a mad woman. She wanted so badly for it all to be a mistake, for Scott to come and get her, and the kids, and take them home. Finally, Marion got through and begged. "Scott, honey, tell me our divorce isn't true. You couldn't have done this. I love you. We need you." But then she heard a disgruntled woman's voice. "Stop ringing, young lady. The cattle can't come. He's in the shower. We have a relationship, almost a family, and he doesn't want to know you. Isn't it clear? Have some pride. Don't call here again." A short beep went off. Marion sobbed silently. So it was true. Her husband is having fun with someone else, and he doesn't love her at all, and he doesn't want children. Then Marion looked at her little ones, and such anger took her. The woman clenched her fists and muttered, "Do you think you broke me? Trampled me? Mixed me with mud? You think I'll give up? No, I'll fight. I'll survive for my girls. And you'll be sorry, you bastard." Oscar took Marion home from the hospital and introduced her to his mum. "Mummy, meet Marion and her beautiful babies. Angelina, Amelia, and Veronica. I've invited them to come and stay with us. You won't mind, will you? You see, Marion's just out of surgery. And as it happens, she's homeless. It's a difficult situation." Marion squirmed inwardly and said hello timidly. She had already imagined what a scandal it would be. Who would like to have small children and a strange woman in the house? But to her surprise, Oscar's mum only smiled welcomingly. "My name is Mrs. Samantha. I understand and trust my son. As long as he chooses to do so, I don't mind. Don't be shy, Marion, come in. Oscar has prepared everything in the bedroom. Make yourself at home. You don't worry about the children, they won't bother me. I'll help you in any way I can." Tears came to the woman's eyes and she began to thank him. "Thank you very much for sheltering me. I will try to settle down and move out as soon as possible. But now you are just saving me." "I'll never forget this," Marion said, and walked into the bedroom and gasped. There was a cot, a pram, and on the bedside table, nappies and baby stuff. "Oscar, wow. When did you have time to buy all this stuff? You must have spent a lot of money. I'm so grateful to you." The man reassured her, but he was very pleased with the warm words. "Don't worry, not at all. I called all my friends and acquaintances, so the whole world came together. It was the hardest thing to find a pram. I could hardly find a two-seater one. We will have to walk together, 2 in the pram, the 3rd in my arms, otherwise there is no way. And the cot I myself have already finalized and expanded. I think all 3 girls will fit. There are a lot of toys and rattles in the bags. In general, I have collected dowry for your beauties. We'll be fine." At first, Marion was very shy. She tried to walk quietly, worried that the children did not scream and did not bother the owners. and she was very grateful to Mrs. Samantha and Oscar for their help with the babies. She would never have been able to cope with 3 on her own. In the family, everything worked out according to their own system. Everyone had their own job in turn. One washed, one held, one carried to the cot. Oscar, as a medical man, taught the inexperienced mum a lot, and soon they were so united that from the outside it seemed as if they were one big and friendly family. Mrs. Samantha adored the babies, singing beautiful lullabies to them, knitting, coddling, and saying, "Sleep, little one, sleep, little flower, sleep, beloved angel." And one day she dared to ask her son, "Confess, Oscar, are the girls yours? Did you have an affair with Marian? I knew right away that she was not a stranger to us. Such a good woman." The man sighed. "No, Mammy, the babies are not mine by blood, but I love them with all my heart. And Marian too, but that's a big secret." Mummy nodded understandingly, crossed herself, and smiled blissfully. She saw how her son had been transformed by Marian's arrival, how important she was to him, and wished him nothing but happiness. Cattle returned from his trip fresh, tanned, and in high spirits. There was an important business meeting at work with Mr. Adrian, an investor. A lot depended on it, and the man prepared thoroughly, even rehearsed his speech. But everything did not go as planned. Mr. Adrian began congratulating Scott almost immediately after the greeting. "Congratulations. You and your wife have had triplets, haven't you? Children are wonderful. It's so uplifting and inspires you to new achievements and feats. I raised 2 myself. I realize how hard it will be for you at first, but believe me, it won't last long. My boys seem to have grown up quickly and fled their parents' nest. Your little girls will be beautiful before you know it. You know what? I'm inviting you and your wife and kids to my country mansion. I'd love to see the babies. I have to tell you, I love to take care of kids. They're in an informal, pleasant atmosphere. We will talk about business." The cattle had nowhere to go, so he agreed. "That's a great idea. Of course we will come. Thanks for the congratulations. See you later." But he grabbed his head and, as usual, called his mother and told her everything in colors. "It's over, Mum. The deal's off. What to do? Even if I find out where Marian lives now, I'm sure she won't want to go home with me to the investor and pretend to be a happy family. I know her temper." Mrs. Rachel hesitated for a moment. "Yes, you're right. That silly girl will only mess things up. But we'll do the tricky part. You're the father of the kids anyway, so scare her that you'll take them away for a day, because you have the right, and tell the investor about your wife that she's ill, that she couldn't come to visit. I'll hire a nanny from the agency to help you with the kids. That's it. And then when Mr. Adrian's deal goes through, you give the kids back. No more problems." "What a great idea you've got." "I'll do it," Scott agreed. He made inquiries at the maternity hospital and found out that the ex-wife had been taken in by an orderly out of pity. He got the address too. The nurses gave it willingly, thinking that the children's father had come to his senses and was looking for them to reconcile. Knocking on the flat door, Scott was so confident he could get his ex-wife to give up the kids that he even smiled cheekily. But things didn't go according to plan. Marian, just seeing him, screamed, "Get out," and slammed the door in his face. The man was stunned, but he wasn't about to give up. He pounded on the door and waited. And then a stocky guy came to the door and said sharply, "What do you want? Marian won't talk to you. Go away. You're divorced. You gave up the children yourself, so there's nothing more to do with you." Cattle was furious. He wasn't used to being rejected. And then some arrogant man started to reprimand him. The man said, "Who are you to meddle with my wife and me? I'm the father of the children and I have a right to see them. Okay? Get Marian, I need to talk to her." Marion came to the door and in a broken voice began to speak. "What kind of father are you? While I was having my children, you were having fun with your mistress. Your mom said you even bought her a house. According to the documents, you're not a father. There's a dash in this box. Your mother warned me strictly not to take your surname. Go away. Why do you need children all of a sudden? Don't tell me you have a guilty conscience. I won't believe it." Cattle took a chance and told the truth. "All right, I'll tell it like it is. A man I need for work invited me and the kids to visit. Without them, I don't think he'll sign the deal. Give me the girls for tonight. I'll return them later and give you the money." The woman was dumbfounded and shouted, "Are you out of your mind? Are the kids dolls in your opinion or things to borrow for the evening? No, you creep. I'll never do such a thing. You took a mistress instead of me. She's your family now. Get out of here at once and forget all about it." From the bedroom came the crying of the girls. Marion ran to them, and Oscar roughly threw his guest down the stairs. "You wretch. Don't come here or I'll hit you harder." "I'll never hurt Marion. You know it." Cattle was seething with rage. He hated this protective nurse, and he was determined to get even with him. Without him, Marion would be forced to agree and give up the children like a sweetheart. Oscar began to worry about Marion and the babies, and at the family council it was decided that now the woman will not go anywhere alone, or with children without Oscar, just in case the man admonished her. "We need to have proof that your ex is trying to take the girls away. I wish we could record his threats." He regretted thinking of it too late. "I can feel in my heart that he's up to no good and won't just let it go." Marion cried. What an awful family these husband and mother are. And after the divorce, there is no peace. "Mrs. Samantha, Oscar, I'm sorry to drag you into all this. I'm nothing but trouble." The older woman said, "What a lot of people, they have black souls. To speculate on children. Don't talk, Marion, it's not your fault. And you are no longer a stranger to us. I'm sure my Oscar will be able to protect you." A couple of days passed. Cattle never came or called again, and Marion calmed down. She figured Oscar had taught him a good lesson. That day he was coming home late at night when 3 men from the back alley jumped him. They beat him and shouted at him to mind his own business and stay out of Scott's way. At first Oscar was very confused. He was knocked down, but the boy was not timid, took control of himself, so gave the trio a fight back and ran home. Marion aghast, rubbing green oil on his abrasions and wailing, "Lord, what on earth is going on? The bastard has sent thugs, decided to get even. Oscar, let's go to the police, please. I'm afraid for you." But the man shook his head negatively. "Oh, it's no use. What are we going to tell them? There's no proof. No one will believe it. It's all right. I taught them a lesson. They won't risk harassing us again." But in the early hours of the morning, something terrible happened. The police came to Oscar's flat. "Citizen Howard, you're being held on suspicion of the murder of Citizen Parker, with whom you had a fight in the courtyard yesterday. The cameras recorded the whole thing. Parker died during the night without regaining consciousness in intensive care." Mrs. Samantha nearly fainted. Marion sobbed, trying to protect her friend. "That's not what happened. It was my ex Scott who sent the thugs to eliminate Oscar. I can testify, and Oscar was defending himself. He couldn't have killed anyone, I'm sure of it. Oscar, why don't you say something? You didn't kill anyone. Tell them." But the man only mumbled, "It can't be. Did I misjudge the force of the blow? But there were 3 of them attacking. I fought back." Oscar was prosecuted. Marion blamed herself for everything, nervous and crying. Mrs. Samantha was also worried. Her blood pressure was skyrocketing and her heart was aching. All the time the women didn't know how to help him and didn't know what to do next. And then Scott showed up again. He brazenly offered. "Did you get it? Did you get something? Your boyfriend's in jail now, and he's looking at a good sentence. But I can fix it. I've got enough money. Just give me the kids for 24 hours. I don't be stupid. This deal is very important to me, don't you realize? Otherwise, I'll make your life a hell." On the one hand, the woman really wanted to help Oscar. After all, he had suffered because of her. But on the other hand, could she risk her own children and give them to a man who didn't care about them at all? And she didn't. Scott yelled. "You fool, you'll regret it. I'm not saying goodbye. Get ready for more trouble." Marion was on the verge. Nervous milk was almost gone. The girls, too, were not eating and sleeping well. "All the trouble is on your head because of me. I have to help Oscar," Marion said. "Today is the funeral of that raider," the investigator said. "I'm going to the cemetery to see if I can talk to his family. Maybe there's something we can do to straighten things out. I can't do nothing. Stay with the girls, I've just fed them and I'll be home in an hour. What if I find out something?" Mrs. Samantha could not dissuade her, though the woman's heart was so troubled. She felt sorry for her son and for Marion all at once. She sang lullabies. The babies were so pretty, lips, fluffy hair, fists under their cheeks. The old woman sang a lullaby and prayed that everything would work out. Marion went to the cemetery. There was no one near the raider's grave anymore, except for 2 suspicious criminals. The woman instinctively hid behind a lilac bush, switched on the recorder, and listened to their conversation. One was angry and reprimanding the other. "What fools we are, Ben. We killed Kisley for money. Worse than animals. I still feel bad about it." The other only snapped at him. "Look at you, talking like that." He signed up for the job himself. He said, "Where are we going to earn so much money at once?" But Kisley was on drugs anyway. He wouldn't have lasted long. We had to make sure that the orderly stayed here for a long time. Enough of this nonsense. Let's go and have a beer. I'm sick of it myself. The woman's heart was pounding frantically. Now she understood everything. It was Scott who had set it all up, and the poor guy had been killed by his accomplices. Now she had irrefutable proof in her pocket. The woman waited for the bandits to leave and ran home faster than the wind. She couldn't wait to tell Mrs. Samantha and give the police the tape recorder. But the door to the flat was open. Marion felt cold inside. She realized someone else was there. Fear for the children and Mrs. Samantha gave her strength, and she rushed into the flat. The picture was frightening. The landlady was lying on the floor, gasping and wheezing. Her face twisted in pain, and Scott was trying to pick up the babies and steal them away. Marion screamed in a voice that wasn't her own. "What have you done, you scumbag? Stay back. Don't touch the girls. I'll tell the police everything." She started screaming so loud, I think the whole neighborhood heard her. Cattle was very frightened, left the girls, pushed Marion away, and ran out of the flat. He was shaking like a fever. He berated himself with his last words. "What have I done, you cretin? I've had it with this dinner party. The idiotic idea of an investor has ruined my whole life. And if the old woman really dies, then not only the deal, but also my freedom is gone. I've got to run. I've got to run. This has gone too far. But I only came to talk to you, to persuade you to give up the children while Marion's away. Who knew she was going to die?" The neighbors came running to the screams. Mrs. Samantha stopped breathing. Someone called an ambulance and the police, and Marion began to give her heart massage and artificial respiration. Marion had no memory of herself and only woke up when she was dragged away by a paramedic. Mrs. Samantha was rescued, but the medical team were convinced that she had been saved by timely assistance. The woman was taken to hospital, and an exhausted Marion held out the recorder to the policeman with the words, "Please give it to Investigating Officer Collins in person. This is proof that Oscar didn't kill anyone. He's innocent. I'll go to him tomorrow and tell him everything." When all had gone, Marion gave vent to tears. She hugged and kissed her girls and realized how much she loved them more than life and would never give them up for anything. All night she hardly slept. The babies were fussy. Then she cooked food for Mrs. Samantha, and in the morning she collected the children and went with them to the hospital to check on her. Thank God the crisis had passed and the old woman was getting better. She saw Marion with the little ones and began to thank her heartily. "Thank you, my dear. The doctor told me that I owe my life to you. I can't wait to be discharged. How did you manage to get here alone with Amelia, Angelina, and Veronica? It's just all come at once. I'm worried about Oscar. What if he really did kill that bastard? Not on purpose, of course, but in a fight. Anything happens. If he goes to jail, I'm sure my heart will stop forever. How much grief has your ex-husband caused us all? And he gets away with it. Will evil go unpunished?" Marion waved her hands and began to recount with fervor all the events of yesterday, and then added, "I gave the tape to the policeman, and now I'm going to go to the investigating officer and tell him all about it again. I think Oscar will definitely be released now, and hopefully Collins will get to the truth and Scott will be in trouble, and you get well. It's really hard for me to deal with the kids without you. I'm just a load off your mind. You and your son were living quietly, peacefully, and now there's nothing but trouble. What's the matter, girl? Don't be silly." Mrs. Samantha pulled the woman close to her and began to speak. "Yes, at first it was hard for me to get used to the noise in the flat. I was looking at you too, it's true. But my son also had some tough times before he met you. After a patient died, he was dragged through a lot of tests. And even though it was recognized that he was not guilty of death, my son still can't forgive himself. He left the substation himself. He was so depressed. He got a job as an orderly, but it wasn't right. He has a vocation, a talent. He's a doctor from God. And Oscar's personal life is complicated. He can't have children. That's why he and his first wife split up. It's also his pain, which he couldn't reconcile. And when you came to us, it was as if my son came to life. His life made sense. He stopped being sad and silent and started laughing again. So it's you I'm grateful to, Marion. I even thought you were having an affair and that Oscar's babies were yours. But then again, miracles do happen, even though he denies it. Though I can see that my boy loves you sincerely. And the babies too. It's very important for him to take care of children. It's something he's wanted to do for a long time. So I'll be very happy if you have a family with him. I love your girls already. They're sniffing their noses in my arms, and my soul is warmer. They embraced like family, and Marion went to the investigator. He listened to this mother of many children and marveled at the steadfastness of her character. Between conversations, she took the children in turn, fixed their hats, gave them a dummy, and looked at them with tenderness. It was obvious that she was not lying. She looked exhausted herself, circles under her eyes. Her hair was disheveled. Her blouse was wrinkled. And how could she look after herself when she had to watch the kids all day long? You should get a medal for that. And the investigator thought what a bastard her husband was. It's unheard of for him to kick his wife and 3 of his own kids out into the middle of nowhere. And this guy, the suspect, it turns out, saved her, sheltered her, trying to protect her as best he could. How different people can be. Someone's heart is a stone, and the other is able to help someone else for nothing. The investigator was determined to help Marion and bring Scott to light. He hated injustice in general, even more than those greedy businessmen who think that they are allowed everything in the world and do not put ordinary people in anything. So he started looking for evidence. Once again, he called the other 2 participants of the fight for questioning for clarification, and then he brought them in properly. Let them listen to the tape. and they confessed to everything. That it was a certain businessman gave them a lot of money for the order. First to beat up the orderly, and then to get rid of the accomplice. Oscar was finally released, but Scott was handcuffed right at the airport. At the confrontation, Marion screamed hatefully in his face. "You bastard! First you disown your own children. I barely survived this betrayal. If it hadn't been for Oscar, who took me and the kids in, I don't know what would have happened to me now. But tell me, why did you give us that hell afterwards? Why did you want to steal the kids? You didn't need them. You'd do a crime to make a deal, wouldn't you? It's inhuman. Tell me, Scott, when did you become such a monster?" The man sat with his head down. Marion spoke as if she were slapping his cheeks. She was right about everything, but Scott tried to wriggle out of it. "I didn't mean for things to turn out this way at all. But it's your fault. You're the one who drove me to this state. I thought I loved you when I got married, honestly. It was later on, that I got fed up. But you're too simple, too cheap, too uninteresting. We're too different, you know. I need a woman who's a fire, a hurricane, who knows her own worth. I'm a hunter by nature. I'm just bored with life and family. But I wasn't even thinking of divorcing you. I just started going out on the side. I met Jeanette, and she was just what I needed. She had a way with me that kept me on my toes. I was afraid of losing her. Even bought her a house on the seaside in secret from you. And when you got pregnant, I didn't care. But the news of the triplets just killed me. I wasn't ready for that. And you looked a little pale. And Jeanette looked even prettier against you. Anyway, I was a mess and I didn't know how to leave you and stay clean. But my mom worked it out perfectly. She's a master of clever schemes. She prepared the divorce papers in advance, and you stupidly signed it without reading it, thinking it was a simple power of attorney. And then I just ran away to my mistress at sea. I got cold feet. I didn't know how to tell you that I'd fallen out of love, that I didn't want to raise children. So when my mother called me and said that you agreed to divorce and children on me did not write, I even rejoiced. I know it's terrible. I never would have bothered you if it wasn't for Mr. Adrian. This deal was super important to me. What was I supposed to tell him? That I'd left my wife and kids and was living with a mistress and enjoying life. He wouldn't give me a hand after that. Clean and moralistic. I came to you in good faith, Marion. I asked you to give me the children for one night, but you wouldn't listen to me, and you wouldn't listen to me. And your orderly fought with me. He threw me down the stairs, me, a well-known businessman in town. I was furious. I just hated you and him so much that I decided to get even. But even then I wasn't planning anything criminal. I swear I just told him to teach Oscar a lesson so he'd know his place. But it didn't work out that way. Your fiancé turned out to be a good guy and fought off his own assailants. It was only then that I decided to set him up and put him in jail. But you, Marion, you drove me away even then. That was the last straw. I was angry. I mean, what would have happened to your kids in one night? Nothing. But you defended them so fiercely. I couldn't even remember my own anger. I waited till you left the flat and I burst in on that old woman. Told her son was a murderer. If she'd let me take the kids, I'd get her son out of jail. But any normal mother would have agreed, but this one didn't. She started kicking me out, and then she collapsed and started dying. I almost managed to carry the kids. But again I was unlucky, and I ran away. I thought long and hard and decided to go to the sea for a while, to wait it out. I realized what I'd done, all the bad things I'd done, and all because of you, Marion. Why didn't you give me children? I'm a father. I have a right to see them. I would have them back. Everyone was in a stupor. Marion was even speechless. Oscar, too, sat like a statue and marveled at Scott's cynicism. Only the investigator replied dryly. You're not a father, citizen. You're a murderer and a scumbag. And you'll be in prison for a very long time. And you, Marion, I truly admire you. You've overcome everything, and you haven't broken down. And we apologize, Oscar, for mistakenly thinking you were a suspect. You're actually a hero. I've been on the force for years. I've seen it all. I've picked up drug addicts, repeat offenders, thieves. But this is the first time I've ever seen a rich, spoilt mummy's boy ruin his own life for personal ambition. Marion's right. You're a monster. But prison will sober you up quickly. I assure you, your mother's money won't help you there, and you'll quickly realize what you're really worth. And I'll do my best to make sure you get the longest sentence possible. Times were tough for Scott. Jeanette, having learnt about everything, immediately left her lover. She and her influential father did not need such problems. The investor, Mr. Adrian, was outraged by the behavior of the head of the family. He broke off all relations with them and ruined them by buying their firm. Now they're going out into the world. Mrs. Rachel became an outcast for the townspeople. No one wanted to see her or even say hello. She spent all the money she had saved up on lawyers to get her son in prison, to get some leniency and minimal punishment. Mr. Adrian decided to do justice in his own way and help the mother of many children. He transferred an impressive amount of money to her account and explained it this way. I don't want you to lose faith in the decency of people. This money belongs to you and your children by right. It was taken from your ex-husband's business and will be a help to you in your time of need. I hope you will be able to raise your girls with dignity, and they will not be like their scumbag father. I sincerely wish you happiness in your new family, Marion. The woman could not believe it, sincerely thanked this noble man. Now all her troubles were behind her, and everything in her life was better. She and Oscar were married. He immediately, without thought or hesitation, gave the children his surname. The Howards sold the flat, added the money from a generous investor, and bought a spacious house in the country. Now there was enough room for everyone. They also finally bought everything they needed. A comfortable pram for triplets, cradles, many beautiful baby things. And Marion and Mrs. Samantha persuaded Oscar to return to the profession and believe in himself again. He successfully passed his recertification and worked again on the ambulance, rushing to the aid of patients, saving their lives. It was indeed a vocation for a man and brought him inner satisfaction. Oscar's soul was at peace again. After all, now he had everything he dreamed of. A beloved wife, 3 wonderful daughters, and was in demand in his profession. The girls grew up, adored Daddy, reached out to him, and he thought he was the happiest man in the world. Mrs. Samantha still took care of her granddaughters, told them fairy tales, taught them how to moo dumplings, and sincerely loved them as relatives. Marion, too, could now finally relax, led the household, engaged with the children. There was a lot to do. They lived poorly at all, but friendly and without quarrels. The woman found another favorite occupation on a small plot of land. Oscar himself made a greenhouse, and now they always had fresh home-grown vegetables and herbs at home. They sold some to neighbors and acquaintances. Marion was so fascinated by this business that she cared for the plants with great care. She had a light hand. Everything grew perfectly. Marion often watched her favorite girls running around the yard, admired them, and thought, I did it. I made it. I didn't break down like my mom, and I didn't betray my children like my father and ex-husband. My triplets are the greatest value and incentive to live. That nurse in the maternity ward was right. It's not hard at all to be a mom of triplets. It is marvelous, especially when there are relatives and friends who love you sincerely. The years flew by. The girls have already turned 10. Oscar received his holiday money, saved up for a long time, and decided to please the whole family. to take them to the sea for a week. There was no limit to the joy. All ran, gathered children squealed, almost missed the train. Oscar was helping Marion and the girls to get on the bus, pushing them. "Come on, daughter, a leg up. Angelina, give Daddy your hand. Darling, you sit down too, Mummy. Well, now I'll help you. Oh, I think we made it. Tomorrow we'll swim and sunbathe and collect seashells." The children crowded round Oscar and looked out of the window with him while he told them something funny. Marion was also waving to someone and laughing. They did not realize that all this time they were being watched by the station loader. He was looking at the happy family without taking his eyes off them. The chubby, laughing girls, like dolls, how much they loved the father of the family, how they reach out to him. And the woman, a little sad with peace and love in her eyes. Cattle swallowed the lump in his throat, clenched his fists, and strode away. He recognized Marion at once. She hadn't changed much, still as thin as a teenager, and her eyes were the same, green, piercing. 3 daughters, they were his children. The ones he'd given up, the ones he didn't want. It turns out that they are someone's happiness, already quite grown up and so pretty. He recognized himself in the features of little Veronica, the same snub nose, the same scattering of freckles and blonde curls. Mrs. Rachel had secured a modest sentence for her son. After prison, Scott's life went downhill. Business had to be forgotten. He couldn't get hired at any decent place. His mother died a long time ago, unable to withstand the ruin, shame, and universal condemnation. And he barely got a job as a loader at the railway station. No, he didn't drink. He just lived like a zombie, like a robot. He had no joy, no desire for anything. But now he met Marion unexpectedly, and everything in his soul was stirred up. It became so offended that he himself trampled his family and himself took away his happiness. Oscar was on the train at the same time. The whole family played bingo and laughed, and then ate sandwiches. There was absolute happiness in their hearts. And the 3 fidgety and naughty giggles became his mascot. After all, it was with their birth that everything began. "Go to the bank and get a loan for me," she was numbed by her mother-in-law's words. "Eric is probably not that bad," he grumbled to himself. Jean froze on the doorstep of her son's apartment. Eric had been traveling for a week and had asked his mother to stop by, pick up some important documents, scan them, and send them to him. If his wife Madison had been home, he wouldn't have disturbed Jean. But Madison had gone to visit Betty's mother, whom she hadn't seen in years. Even for her daughter's wedding, Betty couldn't attend because of the predictions. Later, Betty's condition improved, but she still had a lot of time on her hands. Then her son got sick, then one thing, another. And time went by. Betty wasn't young, but she still wanted to see her daughter, who'd been living in another city for a long time. So Madison went to visit her while her husband was away on business and her son was at camp. The young woman had plenty of time to be with her relative. "Forgot, damn it, he grinned. "Completely slipped my mind. Slipped out, he grinned. "I've been working too hard. It's a nightmare. I was going to call Madison. It slipped out that she wasn't home either. Pick it up, scan it, and mail it to me. If it's not too much trouble. I'm sorry I had to bother you like this. I didn't expect this myself." It wasn't hard for Jean to help her son. Eric has always been, is, and will always be the most important thing in a woman's life. The meaning of her existence, not otherwise, because Jean had no one else but her son. She separated from her husband when Eric was very young and has not seen him since. The husband, of course, did not pay alimony and was not interested in his son's life, which, however, was more of a plus than a minus. Jean really did not want her husband to participate in the upbringing of her boy. She was afraid that Eric would follow in his father's footsteps and grow up to be the same irresponsible and lazy freak. But fortunately, this did not happen. Eric was very sensitive and attentive, grew up a normal, kind guy, did not grab stars from the sky, but did not sit idly by. True, he couldn't get into the university, he didn't have enough points. And Jin had no money for her son's education, and there was nowhere to get it from. Eric was not too upset about it. He reassured his mother it's nothing. He grinned when Jean, almost crying, apologized to her son. The woman was ashamed that all her life she had lived almost in poverty, working 3 jobs and not seeing the light of day, and still could not give her son all the best. She didn't even have money for paid education, not to mention real estate and other things available only to the children of the rich. For someone like Eric, they were a pipe dream. But unlike his mother, he was never discouraged. Poverty didn't bother him at all. Small is not small, he used to say. And about education, Eric considered it pointless. Mom, but who sits in these universities now? He pondered, convincing Jean. Who needs it? You're right, only rich kids have time to sit around for 5 years. I, for example, do not have such time. And I'm not interested in it. After school, Eric went straight to work. He was not taken into the army for health reasons, and it was as if a stone had fallen from Jean's shoulders. Thank God, son. I was so worried, she wailed. What else could she do? Her only son, her own blood, and there would never be another. And no one could bring him back if anything happened. Until then, Eric's fate was quite favorable, which could not but please his mother. Eric grew from a bartender to a restaurant manager and began to receive a fairly decent salary. As soon as his career became certain, Eric thought about starting a family, which caused a storm of emotions and worries in Jean. The future daughter-in-law did not impress the woman properly. Why do you need a country girl, son? Her mother wailed when Eric walked his Madison home after the formal family dinner. She's even younger than you, and she doesn't even know where she came from. I don't know what kind of person she is. In short, she's kind of suspicious. At least that's what I thought. Mom, I didn't grow up in a palace. Either Eric laughed, surprised that his mother was so concerned about Madison's background. And we got the apartment from my grandmother. Just lucky. We were born here. And she's a long way from the metropolis. But that doesn't mean she's any worse than you or me. We have something in common: poverty. Madison is very hardworking and strives for a better life. I'm sure she and I will have a strong family. Eric met his future wife in the same restaurant where he worked. Madison immediately appealed to him. Such a purposeful and active girl could not remain without the attention of the young manager. Therefore, their relationship developed rapidly, as far as possible. This could not help but embarrass Jean, who was shocked when her son told her that he had known Madison for only a few months. So, you're going to marry her already? She exclaimed. You've known a girl for a week and you're ready to drag her to the registry office? You should at least find out who her parents are, what they're like. What if they're alcoholics or worse? I'll have good grandchildren, I can't tell you that. I've dreamed of grandchildren like that my whole life. Madison didn't like to talk about her family. Every time Eric tried to start a conversation about it, she changed the subject. He understood that there was no telling what she might be going through. After all, he wasn't going to marry her relatives. He was going to marry her. Blinded by love, Eric thought Madison was the perfect girl of his dreams: beautiful, smart, determined. He didn't need another bride. He paid no attention to his mother's words. A few weeks after he proposed to Madison, the chief told Eric about his new career prospects. I'm going to be expanding my network. John Smith shared his plans. I think you could help me with that. You've been working for me for so many years, serving me faithfully, so to speak. You can be trusted by me and my institution. So I have an offer I'm sure you won't refuse. Let's talk about it. If you don't mind, of course. I wouldn't want to postpone such important matters. How could you think that? Eric grinned. You know I'm always in favor, especially when it comes to work. That's good, smiled John Smith. Then come to my office in an hour and we'll talk and discuss further plans. Eric was happy when the chief informed him that he wanted to make him his confidant. At last he would have the job he had always dreamed of: traveling, negotiating, looking for places to open new locations in other cities. An amazingly interesting and busy life, and most importantly, a very decent salary. Of course, John Smith promised Eric a substantial fee. It's not just sitting in one restaurant. Compensation for the trouble must be motivating. Well, the chief winked. So we've agreed on everything? Of course, Eric nodded. You have no idea how timely this is. Eric was just about to get married. He needed the money now. He needs to get an apartment. Madison and I weren't going to cramp my mom. That's the right thing to do, Eric reasoned. But I'd be careful with that girl if I were you. Well, so would you, sighed Eric, who didn't understand how Madison could be disliked. She was so wonderful, so amazing. And his mother's attitude toward her potential daughter-in-law was something Eric could understand. Jean was just jealous of her only son. She was afraid that once he married her, he'd drift away from her. At first, he would visit occasionally. Then communication would be limited to phone calls, and eventually they would become a luxury. The woman was just worried that she would be all alone. After all, she had no one but Eric. But what could be confusing in a girl with whom he did not even know? No one. Eric sincerely did not understand, so he did not develop this topic too much. He felt it necessary to ask carefully why Madison suddenly aroused such antipathy in him. Well, I've been around for a while and I've seen a lot of different people, he said meaningfully. I've learned to understand them. And I'll tell you something, Madison. Your girlfriend is very complicated. She never does anything for nothing. I'm guessing you're going to say. What's in it for her with me? If she wanted a favorable arrangement, she would have found herself some millionaire who sprinkled her with gold and the best resorts in the world took her. But if she's with you, then there is a benefit. And then it's a benefit. And then it's up to you to figure it out. As they say, you can't use your own head. Eric didn't take the words seriously at the time. Madison was too precious to him to look for flaws in her. And the girl didn't look like a cunning predator who came to megacities in packs every day in search of a better life. But it seemed so only at first glance. People with experience saw right through Madison, but not Eric. He was too naive and well-mannered. He'd spent his whole life riding up his mom's coattails. He grew up poor, but he was cared for and loved. He just couldn't see the bad in people. Madison didn't even know what Madison was after. Although the girl was indeed not a miss, but showed herself in all her glory much later, which left a deep wound on Eric's heart, which, as it seemed to him, will never heal. And everything had started out so well: wedding rings, traveling, buying an apartment, and plans for the near future. The moment Eric married Madison, he thought he was the happiest man in the world. Even Jean, who was quite skeptical of her son's family life, couldn't spoil his mood. Eric was elated and hoped that in the very near future his wife would give him a baby boy. It was time for him to become a father, and he didn't want to postpone this important event. Only Madison didn't show much initiative. To be more precise, she wasn't going to have a baby at all, and did everything she could to avoid getting pregnant. But she didn't tell Eric about it, of course. With all her might, the girl pretended that, just like him, worried about the lack of heirs. Allegedly ran to doctors, each of whom said the same thing, which Madison then, with a sigh, recounted to Eric. And he believed her and waited patiently for the moment when all the problems would be resolved. Eric didn't even realize that would never happen, because there were no problems. Madison couldn't stand children. She was allergic to infant crying and screaming. She herself had grown up in a large family, and instead of reading books, going out with friends, and doing useful things for herself, Madison had to babysit the younger ones her mother gave birth to. When Betty learned that her daughter had made a good deal, she was happy for her, but reminded her of the younger children. Don't forget to send us some money. Just a little bit, but at least something. Rachel's shoes are worn out, and Anthony needs to get ready for school. "You know I don't make that much," Madison thought to herself indignantly. "Did I really give birth so I could work for all of you?" She married out of a peculiar calculation. Initially, Madison realized that Eric could not provide her with a rich and luxurious life. But he had something important. He genuinely loved Madison and would do anything for her. Besides, Eric was a local resident and had his own apartment. He was a very favorable candidate for Madison, and it would be foolish to pass him up. If she married some fat rich man, she would be enslaved, and her whole life would be reduced to satisfying the whims of an old rich man. That was not Madison's plan at all. After the wedding, she was able to quit her demanding job and stay home. Eric hoped that Madison was about to give him a baby boy, and then a second and third child. He wanted a large and strong large family, so he decided that Madison would take care of the house, the nest, and household issues. When buying an apartment, Eric did not skimp, took a large and spacious. This really upset Jean, who hated her daughter-in-law, but hoped that the young people would live with her. The apartment needed renovation, and she expected the newlyweds to do it. However, Eric wanted to live separately with his wife and hoped that his mother would understand him. "Mom, we cannot live with you under the same roof. You don't like Madison and are against our relationship. Sooner or later there will be conflict, and I don't want that. Besides, we want lots of kids. And you're not old enough. You need a vacation, not a baby crying at night." And so it was. Only Jean was very afraid for her son and did not trust Madison. And as it turned out, with good reason. About a year after the wedding, the daughter-in-law never gave her son the long-awaited heir. Mother-in-law increasingly often asked uncomfortable questions: how and why. All this very annoyed Madison, who steadily drank birth control pills and prayed not to get pregnant. But contraception failed her. Madison went to great lengths to feign joy when Eric guessed she was pregnant because of her recent poor health. Until recently, Madison hadn't believed she was knocked up, writing it off as overwork. But when she discovered the delay, she was horrified to realize that she couldn't escape her fate. Termination of pregnancy was out of the question. Eric would have realized everything and divorced her. She had no choice. She had to register and pretend to be happy. "How long have I waited for this?" exclaimed Eric over the moon. Finally, the dream has come true. The long-awaited baby is about to be born. From this moment on, Madison and I will begin a new beginning in our relationship. Throughout her pregnancy, Madison had been feeling very ill, which made her disgusted mood even worse. "Damn this pregnancy," she resented, complaining to her mother about feeling sick. "May it all burn blue. I hate it. That's what these modern methods led to. Now my whole life is down the drain. I don't know what I'm going to do. I have no experience. This baby will be born soon, and I'll have to take care of it around the clock." Betty was horrified by her daughter's words. She hoped that these emotions were temporary and would pass soon. "Are you out of your mind, Madison?" she wailed. "Children, this is happiness, and there's no escape. You married a townie with an apartment, and now you're working your ass off. What else can I tell you?" Betty didn't attend her daughter's wedding. Madison asked her not to come. "But you realize that bringing all these people here, Rachel and Tyler, is going to raise questions," Madison reasoned. "It's not good for me, you know. Eric's mom can't stand me. And if she finds out I have a large family, it'll be the end of me. But it doesn't matter to you. You can look at the pictures later. And it's not going to be anything special. It's just a celebration with all the trimmings." Betty didn't have anyone to leave the kids with. So there was some truth to what her daughter said. And she didn't want to ruin Madison's personal life. Her future depended on it. Rachel and Tyler are no strangers to family. Madison did send money. And after she started dating Eric, the amount even increased a little. At that time, still future husband always gave her beloved pocket money, and she sent them to the family. Betty could not be happy, finally bought normal shoes for her brother and sister, clothes. "Thank you, my daughter," she wailed, almost crying. "Thank you for not forgetting your family. I don't know how to thank you." Madison wasn't doing all this for her mother, her brother and sister, but for herself. If it were up to her, she wouldn't give a dime to her family. But the girl was not ready to listen to the regular reproaches of her mother. So she gave Betty a little money for poverty, just so that she would not bother. And so it went on until the birth. With the birth of the child, Madison planned to change the established order and perhaps remove the mother from the maintenance, if because of her lies would not fall into a trap. After that, there was no way Madison was going to be without her mother's help. Although who would have thought that things would turn out this way? They say old love never rusts. Only in Madison's case, it wasn't love, it was entertainment. But still, it was better than nothing at all. After the arrival of his son, Eric worked even harder. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? The happy father tried hard for the sake of his son's bright future, so that the boy by adulthood had an apartment, a car, and a good education. And Eric did not plan to stop there. As soon as Braden was born, he immediately started talking about a second child. But Madison had given herself her word that this was the first and last birth of her life, never again. She vowed to herself as she looked in the hospital restroom mirror. Eric was bouncing with happiness and delight, and Madison struggled to bring herself to hold her son to her chest. Her whole body ached. She struggled to move her legs and cursed the contraception that had failed her. "Doctor, do whatever you want," Madison begged when she finally managed to talk to a doctor. For a few days after the birth, the world revolved around little Braden, and no one cared about Madison's suffering. At least that's how it seemed to her. Deep down, she hated her son. The boy caused Madison absolutely no feelings or emotions other than disgust. "God, how awful this is," she muttered to herself under her breath, trying to get away from the difficult labor. She couldn't imagine how she had survived it all. However, after a while, Madison thanked fate for the fact that the birth of her son was given to her so hard. It turned out that because of several mistakes made by the obstetrician and the complexity of the whole process, she is unlikely to ever become a mother again. "You know, it happens," the doctor sighed regretfully. She had no idea how happy Madison was to hear those words. Of course, there was no 100% guarantee, and the girl planned to keep taking the pills. But it was at least something. She definitely wouldn't be able to take it again. It was so awful that Madison didn't even want to remember it. She asked the doctor not to say anything to her husband yet. She didn't know how Eric would react to the fact that this was likely to be the first and last time he became a father. He could get angry or make a scene and blame the doctors. Madison didn't want that, especially since the doctor wasn't saying anything definitive. "Time will tell," she reasoned. "We'll live to see. Maybe I'm being overdramatic, but I just couldn't not tell you." Madison really hoped the doctor's prognosis would come true. There has to be a holiday on my street after all. I should be able to breathe easy and free. I deserve it. Especially since the role of a mother of many children the girl has never enticed. Life at the ready, this is yes, but to reproduce like a rabbit, definitely not. It's not my thing. So Madison was convinced that Eric should have tempered his ardor. But since he was not ready for it, the circumstances were very much to the girl's advantage. Madison was only involved in her son's upbringing partly. To throw off her shoulders part of the responsibilities, she was even willing to tolerate her mother-in-law, who was genuinely happy about the birth of a grandson and regularly came to help her daughter-in-law with the child. Eric even offered his mother to temporarily move in with them. "Well, why should you travel?" he reasoned. "Constantly have to travel. And so you get up and do as much as you like. Why not? Especially since your relationship with Madison seems to be on the mend. You're not even criticizing her as much lately as you used to." Jean just didn't want to upset her son. He would surely make excuses for his out-of-touch wife, such as saying that she was still young and inexperienced, so she didn't know how to take care of a child. Eric would never admit that Madison was a bad mother who didn't care about her son. A veil of happiness was covering his eyes, and the man just didn't see it. Jean, on the other hand, saw it all. She had a keen eye for such things. You can't fool an experienced woman. Madison had it all written all over her face. Just a glance and everything became clear at once. Only a lovesick and happy fool like Eric could ignore such obvious things. But that came with time. Jean was sure that sooner or later her son and daughter-in-law's relationship would crack. They were two different worlds. If Eric was a model family man, an honest, decent man, Madison was clearly a man of her own mind, and her soul was black. And someday Eric would see that, just so it wasn't too late. Jean didn't want to think about it. Such thoughts depressed her. Since Braden's birth, all her attention had been focused on her grandson. What happened to Madison was no longer of any importance to her. She wasn't helping her daughter-in-law, but her son, who was struggling to provide a decent living for his family. But despite the fact that Jean stopped reacting to Madison like a bull to a red rag, she absolutely refused to move in with him. She did not change her attitude toward her daughter-in-law and did not want to live with her under the same roof. Eric understood his mother's decision and did not insist. He was very grateful for her help. It can be considered that Braden grew up in the arms of Jean, who did everything that depended on her to ensure that her grandson had a prosperous childhood. When the child grew up, the woman often took him to visit her. Madison was all for it. The less time she had to spend on the child, the better. She had the opportunity to spend those hours on herself. And what could be better than a break from all that work? And her soul was begging for a break. And Madison saw her son as just that, a burden. She was very tired of him and could hardly hide her emotions from her husband, who, as it seemed to her, had completely withdrawn because of constant employment at work. And if he worked for his wife's wants and needs, Madison would not even say a word to him. But Eric wouldn't let her spend any extra money, saving it all for the future. Even to send some money to Betty, Madison had to save the money she'd been given by her husband and find a way. She hardly ever went into the details of her family's life. Meanwhile, her brother and sister were growing up and demanding more and more from their mother every day. They needed money for this, that, and the 10th. Once Betty hinted to her daughter that it would be a good idea to help with Rachel and Tyler's future, to which she said nothing and walked away from the conversation. "Let's not look that far ahead," Madison replied meaningfully to her mother. "When you asked if I could drag my brother and sister to the big city afterward, they're too young to talk about it. When they grow up, when they decide what their future plans are, then we'll talk about it." Madison thought to herself that no one had ever gotten her anywhere or helped her in any way, and for some reason she had to do it again. Or not again, but again. And then Greg showed up if he wasn't laden. He fell on Madison's head like a snowball and brought confusion into her relatively peaceful and trouble-free life. When the former lover, whom Madison dated in her distant youth, wrote to her on social media, she didn't even believe it at first. How did he find her? He'd been looking for her with a purpose. Recently, Greg more and more often remembered his first love. His personal life did not work out, his career did not work out either. And so Gregory was more and more often immersed in the memories of the distant past. Word of mouth got around and they agreed to meet. Madison decided why not. She hadn't even realized that Greg had moved to the big city, too. And it was the one she lived in. After all, they hadn't spoken in years. And this meeting was something she'd wanted at first purely out of curiosity. Madison wondered how the former beau was doing. But after a while, she realized that Greg could be a good entertainment for her. Her husband was constantly missing on his business trips, all the money he made. The son was almost constantly in the care of Jean, who loved her grandson very much. And since her mother-in-law considered Madison a bad mother, she tried as little as possible to give her the opportunity to spend time with her son. And the daughter-in-law was only too glad. There was more than enough time to cheat on her spouse, so she didn't hesitate. Just a few weeks after meeting Greg, she got involved with him. They met in a small rented apartment, in which the young man lived alone for several years. Madison hadn't even considered hiding, just took and left to her lover, dumping her son to her mother-in-law. And the mother-in-law hadn't asked her daughter-in-law any questions in a long time. Yes, and suspicions of Madison's behavior would not have caused Jean, if at some point daughter-in-law did not cross the line. "When are you going to invite me to your house?" Greg, to whom Madison had foolishly promised to invite him to visit, asked. She said that when Eric was on a business trip, she would invite Greg. Madison said, "I'd like to spend time in a normal apartment, not this dump." Greg didn't have money for rent or a hotel. He made an average salary. He lived better than he did in his hometown, but not luxurious. Greg wasn't about to splurge to spend time with a girl he'd once dated behind the garages. It would be too much for him. No amount of love for Madison would make him change his mind. "I'll invite you. I'll definitely invite you," Madison waved him off. "Only you'll be my former classmate, nothing more." "Got it." What, Eric might suddenly come back? Greg grinned. "Then maybe we shouldn't take any chances." "No, it's not that." Madison sighed, knowing her mother-in-law had the keys. The girl's act was as stupid as possible. Anyone else in her position would never have gotten involved in such a venture. But that day, when she and Greg had spontaneously secluded themselves in the marital bedroom, there was no sign of trouble. Eric was on a business trip. The son was at camp. Who would have thought her husband would forget the paperwork he so suddenly needed at home? Madison didn't even hear the door open. Her mother-in-law, on the other hand, knew what was going on right away. It was hard not to guess from the sounds coming from the room. Jean was furious. She was ready to burst into the room and kick her daughter-in-law out of the house. But she found the strength to calm down and look at the situation sensibly. It didn't take much intelligence to cause a scandal and destroy her son's family. Except that Eric would never forgive it. Jean knew that. So she decided to make the best of the situation for herself and her son. Instead of barging into the room where her daughter-in-law was having fun with her lover, Jean lurked in the kitchen. Madison and Greg would have come here sooner or later anyway. And that's when Jean would have a frank talk with her sister-in-law. It happened faster than the woman would have guessed. No sooner had her mother-in-law made tea than she heard footsteps in the hallway, and a moment later, curses pouring from her sister-in-law's mouth. "Oh, shit," Madison exclaimed when she saw her mother-in-law's boots in the hallway. Damn, disbelievingly forgot I hadn't locked the secret door. That's why Jean was able to open the door with her key. How could I?" Continued Madison's indignation, who was so confused she didn't know what to do next. Her thoughts were confused and she was overwhelmed with shame. The girl walked to the kitchen where her mother-in-law was sitting and drinking tea. Madison could not immediately find the right words to start a conversation. She realized that in the best case she would face a scandal and divorce. And at worst, it was scary to imagine what someone like Jean could do for the sake of her son. She will stop at nothing to avenge his suffering. That's why her mother-in-law's proposal sounded unexpected. For a few minutes, she speculated about Eric's feelings and what such a situation might lead to. When Greg appeared in the doorway, the mother-in-law demanded that he leave. "You weren't called here," she exclaimed. "No shame, no conscience. Not only are you sleeping with another man's wife, you're interfering in the conversation." "Greg, you really should leave now," Madison muttered, confused. "Wait for me in my room, I'll talk to you in a minute. And then we'll pack up and leave together." The grief-stricken lover had nothing to do but obey. He was no less confused than Madison, because he had not expected it to turn out this way. Greg imagined what problems awaited his friend in life, and he didn't want to be a part of them. Madison was ready for everything, except for the fact that her mother-in-law would be so cynical about the situation and demand money for her silence. "So, that's it?" the mother-in-law said, looking Madison intently in the eye. Jean's tone did not bode well. So the girl froze, waiting to hear what she was so afraid of. And after all, divorce was not part of her plans at all. Next to Eric, Madison lived quite freely. He was constantly working, and despite the fact that he saved most of the money, still provided her with quite a comfortable life. Her mother-in-law took care of her son most of the time. It was a dream life, and Madison was in danger of losing it all. But she did. In return for her silence, her mother-in-law demanded a large sum of money, which Madison had no place to get. "If you want to have fun, Jean said. As they say, bad things are easy, and you are not capable of anything else in this life. But my son mustn't suffer. If he did something stupid by getting involved with you, then my Eric doesn't have to be responsible for all your shenanigans. And I'm prepared to keep your affair from him. It will avoid a scandal and save your marriage. But in return, you'll owe me something, and don't take too long. I need the money as soon as possible. If I don't get it, I'll tell my son. Then you can kiss this apartment and your carefree life goodbye. And considering that you haven't worked or done anything for years, it's not hard to guess that you'll be left with nothing. You'll go back to the country where you belong." Madison guessed why her mother-in-law needed such a large sum of money, but she didn't dare to say it. "Where would I get that kind of money?" she mumbled confusedly. "You know I don't have a penny. Eric handles all the finances in our family. Maybe you should ask him." Her mother-in-law laughed. Jean didn't know how to react to her daughter-in-law's absurd suggestion. If she could ask her son for money, she would definitely do it. And she had already tried many times. "Mom, well, understand you, but I cannot invest such a large amount of money to repair your apartment," justified the son. "You know Madison and I have a baby. I'm saving every penny I can to buy another place to live. I have to think about my son's future, and by the way, your grandson's. You love Braden too, don't you? We should have sold the old place a long time ago. It's more profitable than fixing it up. You're not a stupid woman. You know that. And frankly, I'm amazed at your persistence." Jean would be happy to sell the apartment, but could not, because her late mother strictly forbade her to do so. When Alexander was alive, Georgia gave her daughter her word that she would never leave her inheritance in the hands of strangers. "You see, this apartment is the whole meaning of my life with my father," said the woman. "It was inherited from my late mother and must pass from generation to generation, while remaining in our family. It has a special energy, and the apartment itself is special. You just don't realize it yet, but in time you will." Jin really didn't understand. Her late mother's words were still a mystery to her to this day. What were these features of the inherited apartment that her mother was talking about? What was so special about it? And why Alexandra Georgia so did not want the dwelling to ever end up in the wrong hands? For the modern world, her desire was wild. Selling old apartments and buying new ones had long since become commonplace, and it was at least strange to cling to a property whose walls were about to fall off. But Jean had to do it. Since Jean could no longer live with the encroaching mold in the kitchen, bathroom, and wallpaper yellowed from dilapidation, she had to get the money for repairs somewhere. Jean even tried to take out a loan, but was turned down. "Apparently the income is very small," she sighed to herself when she got home from the bank. "And the age is not the same. The amount is large. Apparently they're afraid that I'll die and won't pay it back. Bastards." And Eric, on principle, did not want to spend on this junk. He bought a new home, and his mother's apartment was not needed for nothing. Just because Jean didn't want to sell it wasn't his problem. And it didn't mean Eric had to shell out the money to fix it up. The woman wasn't going to sit idly by. And the way things had turned out, it was the perfect excuse to get the money she needed. Jean had no doubt that her sister-in-law would get the money. People like her dig with their noses. But they'll get their way. "Go to the bank, get a loan," she said, breaking the silence between them. "I don't care. And at the same time to get a job. Because not bad so settled on the neck of my Eric. You don't work, you don't raise your son? The boy's with me all the time. You will start to do something, if of course you want to keep the family. Finishing her tea, her mother-in-law declined, and Madison returned to her lover Greg's room, who by now was sitting fully clothed on the bed, perplexed. "No, well, did you hear that?" exclaimed the girl indignantly. "What an insolent woman. It's just lawlessness. And after all, always from herself so good and decent built, but in fact unscrupulous and unprincipled. A blackmailer. What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to get such money? Should I steal it? This is out of the question. It's a nightmare." Greg didn't understand what was being said, as he hadn't heard Madison's conversation with her mother-in-law. But when his mistress brought him up to speed, the man had a plan, and a very cruel one at that, listening to which even Madison with her cynicism was a little confused. "Don't be in a hurry to refuse," Greg said. "You'd better think about my offer. We'll kill a lot of birds with one stone. We'll give your mother-in-law money for repairs, and you can leave your husband at any time. That's what you want, isn't it? If you didn't want a baby, you'd be hanging out with me right now." No, divorcing Eric and marrying Greg were not in Madison's plans at all. She was happy with the status quo: one man for life, another for bed. It was the way many married women lived, and she was no exception. Madison didn't want to get involved in such a risky venture with her lover, but only until she realized with horror that she had no choice but to heed Greg's advice and put his plan into action. Turning to credit organizations was absurd. Who would give a loan to someone who was unemployed? A quick and easy way to make money was the only way Madison could solve her problem, and after a few days she realized that she simply had no other choice but to accept. "What are you so worried about?" Greg reassured his mistress. "You don't even have to do anything. I'll do everything myself. You, most importantly, agreed with your mom. Will she agree to help you?" "Of course she will," Madison sighed. Where's she supposed to go? On that fateful day, Jean was walking with Braden on the playground as usual. Before she knew it, the poor woman had been hit on the head with something heavy. It was early in the morning, so there were no witnesses to the incident. As soon as Jean woke up, she immediately ran to look for her grandson. But the boy was nowhere to be found, and naturally no one had seen or heard anything. Braden liked to walk early in the morning. He was generally a very active and mobile child. He got up at dawn and went to bed very late. In a word, restless. And now he's gone. "God, how can I look into my son's eyes?" sobbed Jean, sitting in the police station, where she went as soon as she realized that her own efforts to find her grandson will not lead to any results. "You could use some help yourself," the investigator told her. "Preferably medical help. Why didn't you call an ambulance? How long have you been lying in the street on the damp ground? You have a very serious head injury. You can't let this go unaddressed." "What the hell kind of ambulance? Hit and run? Jean, are you kidding me? Don't you get it? My grandson's missing. My only grandson. And you and your doctors." Jean had to go to the hospital, but she refused to be hospitalized. She was in a hurry to see her daughter-in-law. Jean didn't know how to tell Eric what had happened, and she wanted to put Madison in charge. And at that moment, her mother-in-law didn't even realize that her daughter-in-law might have been involved in all of this. It was only when she arrived at Madison's house and found her sobbing over a note demanding a substantial ransom that she realized what was going on. At that moment, Jean was overcome with fear and her chest pinched with guilt. "And damn it," said the poor woman, "how the hell did I not realize it at once?" That's how she decided to get the money. If I hadn't asked for it, Braden would have been all right. But Madison had no proof that her mother-in-law had anything to do with it, and she could hardly keep from hurling accusations at her. Eric was due back from another business trip any day now, and Jean was afraid to imagine what would happen when he found out. Madison was hysterical, smearing mascara on her face from her tear-stained eyes, wailing, wondering what to do next. "We have to call Eric right away," she insisted. "We can't wait, and what if they do something to the baby in the meantime? Tell him to come back from his business trip immediately. We have to pay, or I risk losing my son. We can't let that happen." Jean insisted on waiting for Eric to return. "The police are in charge of this case," she argued. "There's no way we can pay the ransom. Maybe the police could find something, get a lead on something. After all, we weren't walking in a field. We were in a playground in the middle of apartment buildings. Somebody must have seen us. Right? The cops have already started a search. Wait to see if there's any news." But Madison needed a ransom, so she played out another terrifying episode. Greg called her on Messenger at his mistress's request and showing her a video of a bound Braden, mouth taped shut, rambling menacingly. "No police. If you report anywhere, I'll finish the kid. Bring the money tomorrow." "I've got the address." "That's it. Come on, why?" It was impossible to recognize the man. He was dressed all in black, wearing a mask with slits for eyes. Greg's voice had been altered by a computer program. Immediately after the call, Madison continued her feigned hysteria. "Don't you see?" she sobbed. "They know everything about us. They know everything about us. We have to call Eric right now. There's no other way out. We have to give them the money, or Braden's dead." Madison frantically dialed her husband's number and told him everything, and Eric left everything to rush into town. On the way, he contacted Anthony Adams and, stammering, explained the situation. The chief immediately suspected something wrong and asked him not to do anything until he arrived. "Don't you understand?" Anthony Adams asked, looking at Eric trembling with fear. "Is everything here sewn up with white threads?" Anthony Adams arrived at Eric's apartment before the man could even get up. Anthony Adams, like Jean, knew what was going on. Eric, on the other hand, didn't realize what he was supposed to realize. "I sense that your wife is not the only one involved," Anthony Adams said openly, and was immediately confronted with a wave of indignation. "What are you talking about?" Eric was outraged. "How could you? What does Madison have to do with this? Aren't you saying that she organized the kidnapping of her own son?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Anthony nodded. "I've been doing some digging into her background, and I want to tell you that I found a lot of interesting things. I'll give it to you sometime. You can read it at your leisure." At that moment, Eric was hardly aware of reality and was completely unable to adequately perceive any information, especially that concerning his wife. It seemed to him that Anthony was delusional and would take back his words at the first opportunity. But Anthony Adams wasn't going to do that. "If you don't mind, I'm going up with you," he said. "I'm sure it would be best if we could work this out together, especially since you can hardly do without my help." And Eric didn't care. Not at all. The only thing he cared about at that moment was where his son was and what about him. As they sobbed uncontrollably, Madison handed her husband a ransom note and told him about the kidnapper's call. Anthony Adams confirmed his suspicions. Jean remained silent. She could see how depressed her son was, who was ready to run to the bank to order the necessary amount of money. "We'll pay," Eric said firmly. "As much as they say, just to get Braden back. I have one son and I don't need him, and money is nothing. I'll make more money." When he found out the mother had gone to the police, he was very angry. "Why did you do it?" Eric exclaimed. "Who asked you to do that? You have to go and get your statement now. Don't you understand? They could kill Braden. Or don't you care how you got that idea?" "I did it before I knew about the visitor's note," Jean muttered confusedly. "But if you insist, which is fine, I'll take back my statement now. I'll say that Braden was found, ran away, lost. He was picked up by some random passerby walking his dog. And he's home now, and he's home now, and he's perfectly fine." "So stop." Anthony Adams intervened in the conversation. who was beginning to be annoyed by this circus. Nobody's going anywhere. That's clear. We'll give the money to them, get Braden back, and then we'll figure out what's what. The man was a man of action, and as soon as he and Eric went to the bank, he offered to plant counterfeit money on the kidnappers. I printed a whole bunch of them once he laughed, just for laughs and to test my skills. The bills were in the safe, and I never used them. But it turned out to be useful. Who knew? Eric was not laughing at that moment, and he sincerely did not understand what Anthony was so happy. "Your crazy idea, of course I refuse," said the man. "I have one son, and God forbid anything should happen to him. No one will give him back to me. So no such jokes. We'll go to the bank right now. I'll order the money, and then we'll take it to where the kidnappers said. They're going to give me my Braden back." I don't believe it, sighed Anthony Adams, who had no intention of backing down. Anthony continued to convince Eric to do what he had in mind. Anthony Adams was confident that Braden was in no danger. "Do you want me to contact a man who can find your son in a matter of hours?" he offered. "You sure you can do that?" "You want me to promise you the boy will be fine." Anthony Adams knew Madison's background, his mom and his brother and sister. He knew that's where Braden had been taken. There was nowhere else to go. It was unlikely Madison had hired some professional thugs to keep the kid in a dark basement. The mother was in total need of money, so it was highly likely she would have agreed to this adventure, knowing that Eric was willing to do absolutely anything for her son's sake. "Let's go for a ride," Anthony Adams suggested. "What have we got to lose? Let's go and see what's going on. If Braden isn't there, well, then we'll figure out what to do next. But I'm pretty sure your wife took the boy to his mother, who also decided to make a quick and easy buck and help her daughter stage the kidnapping." Eric didn't want to believe any of this nonsense. He couldn't believe that his wife was capable of such a thing. The man refused until the last, justifying himself by saying that he did not want to risk the life and health of his son. But in the end, Anthony Adams managed to persuade him. "All right, let's go," he agreed. "Only if something happens to my son. You do realize that if your assumptions are wrong, I could lose my child." "Yes, I understand everything," Anthony Adams waved away, who was absolutely certain he was right. He had already contacted his security chief. "My boys are coming with us," the man said. "We'll pick them up now." Eric couldn't believe this was all happening to him. It wasn't until they actually found Braden at Betty's that the man had to face the harsh reality. Bursting into a small apartment located in a cottage, Anthony Adams and his guys immediately took the woman in a turn. And she didn't hide her grandson at all. "The daughter asked me to help, so she did." "But is that a crime?" the woman wondered. "I'm Braden's grandmother, and he can stay with me." As unfortunate as it was, Madison could indeed get away with it. Unless, of course, it could be proven that Greg had demanded the money from Eric. Anthony Adams had been too heavy-handed and head-on. After the father and his boss had taken Braden away from Betty, the woman had called her daughter immediately. "Ladies," whispered Madison, who had no choice but to run out into the stairwell. When she saw her mother's cell phone number pop up on the screen, "I'm listening to you. What's wrong?" "Quit your adventure," Betty whispered. "Your husband just arrived with some men. I don't know how they got my address and guessed I had Braden, but they took your son." "God, Madison, why did I even get involved in this? I mean, we could go to jail." "What about the kids? Do you have any idea what's going to happen to them? Your Greg's idea was completely absurd. You're on your own now." Betty agreed to help her daughter just for the money. Madison had promised a substantial sum of money for her to take Braden in for a while. "What are you guys up to?" the woman asked excitedly. "Why would you drag a baby all the way out here? A several-hour car ride." "Mommy, it's the way it has to be," Madison replied. "Can't you just help me?" Madison didn't go into details. She only told me briefly, assuring me that everything would be okay. And that's how it turned out. Her mother knew about her daughter's relationship with Greg and didn't understand her at all. It would have been fine if you'd traded your Eric for some wealthy man, the woman reasoned. But who did you get involved with? That beggarly bastard. He was a fool, and he's still a fool. No good will ever come of him. So you're wasting your time with your husband. If he finds out, it'll be bad for you and your son. Madison was less interested in Braden's fate than in her own well-being. When her mother had told her that their whole adventure had been discovered, Madison had been terrified. What's going to happen now? Madison lamented. She contacted Greg. Would Eric put me with his son? Don't worry about it, grinned the grief-stricken lover, who had no doubt they'd get away with it. They'll never prove anything in their lives. So they ran your address, got your background, found Braden. So you went to your grandmother's house. What's the big deal? You won't get the money, which means you won't be able to pay off your mother-in-law. What mother-in-law? Madison was furious. What are you talking about? Eric's going to divorce me anyway. It's over. How can you not see that? There was no doubt about it. Eric came home very angry and, without even saying hello, asked his mother to take Braden for a walk while he talked to his wife. Anthony Adams did not accompany him, thinking it would be embarrassing already. Well, he smiled. I'm glad you've finally seen the light. I warned you, and as you can see, my intuition was right. Good luck to you. I'll see you at work. Me and the guys are going on vacation. Madison could tell by the look on Eric's face that nothing good was in store for her. She'd never seen her husband so angry. Well, he said, looking intently into his wife's eyes, let's not put our conversation on hold. Eric literally flooded Madison with questions about the family and everything else, but most importantly, about Braden. How could you? He wondered. He's your son. He's not just mine, he's yours. And you. I can't even imagine how I could be so wrong about you. I hope you realize I won't let you anywhere near my son now. If you think you're going to get off scot-free, you're not. You know how much Braden means to me and how much I love him. He's the most precious thing I have. I loved you too. I loved you too. I loved you so much. But as it turns out, you betrayed me. And you did it so stupidly. Did you really think what you were planning would go away? I'm not a complete fool. And I'm not surrounded by idiots. The same Anthony Adams. I mean, he knew what you were right away. I'm the one who's a fool for believing you, and you're the one who didn't. Madison realized that she had nothing to lose, and decided to tell her husband what prompted her to this stupid and reckless act. Listen to me, Eric, she exclaimed. I think you should know about this. It was your mother. If she hadn't started blackmailing me and demanding money, none of this would have happened. I'm sorry, but I just can't keep quiet. It's too much. So Madison told her husband, hoping to drive a wedge between her and Jean. Eric, however, resented his wife for taking it out on his mother. What does she have to do with this? He resented. How dare you accuse her of anything? And you tell me about all this as if nothing happened. You also cheated on me, that is, betrayed me. And it's my mother's fault. Well, of course, who else would it be? Eric couldn't take his wife's words adequately. Later, when things had settled down a few days later, Madison had no choice but to leave home that same day and temporarily move back in with her mother and brother and sister. She had some money to rent an apartment. But before she could start a new life, Madison needed to process everything that had happened. She couldn't get her head around the fact that Eric had figured her out so quickly, and she and Greg and Betty wouldn't get a dime. Eric was going to have a separate and very serious conversation with Jean. If what Madison had said was true, it was another low blow. So besides his wife, his mother had betrayed him. And that wasn't an easy thing to get over. Oh my God, son, how could you think such a thing? Jean wailed when Eric asked her directly if Madison was telling the truth. I didn't mean it. I couldn't even imagine that she would come up with something like that. Eric realized that he was partly to blame for what had happened to his son. If he'd agreed to pay for his mother's repairs, it wouldn't have occurred to her to blackmail her daughter-in-law. But cheating was a very mean thing to do. And Eric couldn't understand why his mother hid the fact of his wife's infidelity from him. Why are you doing this to me? Did you have the decency to hide the fact that Madison was cheating on me? Bringing a lover into our apartment and having fun with him in our marital bed. Son, but I meant well. Jean sighed bitterly. I didn't want to destroy your family, since you chose Madison and she gave birth to your son. Then it was meant to be, fate had decreed it. I had no right to interfere. I was hoping that after this she'd come to her senses, get a job. After all, she wasn't doing anything good. But instead of coming to her senses, she faked her son's kidnapping. How was I supposed to know she was capable of that? I guess Braden was the only good thing left in Eric's life after everything that had happened. His mother and his wife had treated him like scum, and he loved them so dearly. But he decided not to litigate or file a complaint. He would just divorce Madison and help Jean with the repairs. She was finally able to tell Eric why she'd resisted selling the apartment. And after that, everything fell into place. Eric was a big dreamer. After listening to his mother, he immediately started building barricades in his head and inventing secrets, which made Jean smile skeptically. Son, she grinned. Do you really think that if we take apart the old rubble, we'll find something we don't know about? Do you believe it yourself? That's the thing Eric did. That's why he decided to give his mother money from his savings for the repairs. If Jean hadn't told him about his late grandmother's instructions, he never would have agreed to renovate this wreck. That's how many months of life and wasted time to remove debris, replace wiring. Flooring will take at least 3 months. And you have to supervise the workers. And who better than Eric to do all that? Who else will help his mother if not his beloved only son? Eric didn't know what to do. So much had happened in his life lately. Not so long ago he was absolutely happy and could not even imagine that everything would turn out this way. First of all, the man had to deal with his wife, who in all likelihood will claim the joint apartment. Eric did not think that everything would turn out this way, and did not insure himself in case of divorce. He hoped that Madison had enough conscience not to tear a piece of at least from his son, especially since the house was on credit, and she hadn't made a single payment in all that time. But Eric was wrong. When Madison came to her senses a little after everything that had happened, the first thing she thought of was the apartment. She wanted half of it, of course. How could it be otherwise? It was jointly owned property, after all. At least that was the law. And Eric knew he could hardly argue with that. Eric was willing to give his wife anything to give up her son. He offered a fair deal. He would forget about the whole unpleasant story with the kidnapping and extortion, and she would write an official renunciation of Braden. That's the deal. Otherwise, he'll take action. According to him, if they wanted to, they'd find evidence that she'd kidnapped her own son for ransom. Madison didn't see this coming. She was used to her spouse always being soft and going easy on her. True, Eric had been able to forgive his wife anything before, even infidelity. But not what she'd done. Do you realize how immoral this is? He asked. What if we hadn't found Braden? If Anthony Adams hadn't realized this was your idea? What would you have done with the boy if I hadn't paid the ransom? Madison didn't know the answer and only shrugged her shoulders. She hadn't expected such a development herself. Now she had a difficult choice to make. Daughter, do it, please. Betty instructed, hoping Madison would help her around the house again. You've done so much wrong. If you go to jail, I won't survive it. We've already got 7 of us. How are you going to raise your son on your own? You figure it out. Leave Braden to Eric. You're still young. You'll find happiness. For Madison, happiness was about money and freedom. She'd learned that during her years of marriage. Her son was a burden. She didn't want to spend her life raising him, so she agreed to Eric's proposal. After that, Eric began to repair the apartment of Jean's mother, with whom he had little contact. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't forgive her for taking part in the adventure. Jean understood everything and hoped that Eric would cool down and accept everything that had happened. Most importantly, Madison had disappeared from Eric's life. That was something that Jean was very happy about. Despite the guilt she felt, she realized that it was for the best. If she hadn't caught Madison with her lover and offered to pay her off, Eric might have lived a lifetime of lies. Now, despite the loss, her son had a chance to build a real relationship. That was gratifying, especially since the money lost in the divorce was more than recouped in the most unexpected way. It turned out that Alexandra Georgia, not in vain, asked her daughter not to sell the apartment. The woman had one secret. Soon after the renovation began, mother and son discovered something that made them have to urgently dismiss the workers. They couldn't let either of them know the contents of the stash, which was deep in the wall. As soon as Eric, who had taken some time off to supervise the repairs, saw some strange door, he immediately informed the workers that they could rest temporarily. "How come?" marveled one of them. "We've only just begun." "You'll continue later," replied Eric, who was confident that he could open the hiding place on his own. He immediately called his mother, who was temporarily living with Braden in his apartment. Jean had nowhere else to go during the renovation, and Eric, deep down, was glad to have his mother around. Otherwise, who would take care of Madison's son? She was no longer with them, and never would be. Jean rushed to the apartment with her grandson. By then, Eric had already opened the stash and was sitting on the dirty floor, reading some old dusty notebook and going through some gold jewelry. "Mother of God," Jean exclaimed when she saw it all. "What the hell is this?" It turned out that Alexandra Georgia was not so simple as she seemed at first sight, and had made quite a substantial fortune during her life, which, however, she had not been able to use, for she had received all this gold as gifts from her numerous cavaliers. That was what it was called at the time. No one would ever dare to talk about anything like that openly. For many years, the woman kept both silence and gold, which during the renovation of the apartment she hid in a special cache made by the hands of her spouse. It turns out that Dad knew about all this, Jean muttered confusedly, going through the gold jewelry and reading the lines of her mother's personal diary, which she also put in the stash and did not take out for many years. "Well, Grandma's got it going on," muttered Eric, who was in complete shock at the find. Jean shared her son's feelings completely. Like him, she couldn't believe what she had just read. It was beyond her usual reality of right and wrong and all kinds of principles, and the woman didn't know how to feel about it. Though on the other hand, what did it all matter anyway? Her mother was long since in the grave, and Jean knew so little of her past that it was certainly not her place to judge or condemn Alexandra Georgia. She had done what she thought was right, and no one had the right to point a finger at her, especially not after her death. The question before Eric was what to do with all this now. Grandmother was trying for the future, including his future. She also wanted her children and grandchildren to live richly after her death, which was written in her diary. But it will not be possible to realize it here, he reasoned. Firstly, there is too much gold, and secondly, there are rare and very interesting specimens which can be very valuable. His grandmother's admirers were high-ranking people, and these gifts could be used very profitably. Eric realized that if he sold the entire contents of the small chest, the money would be enough for the rest of his life. Not that he wanted to quit his job and parasitize on everything. It was just that it was a pretty decent capital for the future. And first of all, the man thought not of himself, but of his son, for whom he wanted to provide a good start, so that Braden would not have to break through the wall for career and money. And except for Anthony Adams, Eric had no one else to consult with. He was the only one who could come up with a good idea. and only the chief had such extensive connections, with the help of which the received gold could be converted into big money without the risk of getting into serious trouble with the law. Of course, Eric had offered him a share, as he was convinced it was the right thing to do. But Anthony Adams refused and, laughing, confessed that he had an offer for Eric that he was sure he couldn't refuse. Just as he had a few years ago, Eric smiled. "What's true is true," nodded Anthony Adams, who also noticed that there was such a resemblance. Anthony Adams had long dreamed of growing his business overseas. He was always striving for more, and was by no means going to stop there. And who but Eric he was to send on a long business trip. "There, you live there, and observe everything," the chief reasoned. "Perhaps you'll get the hang of it and won't want to come back, and I'll help you move the wealth overseas. I've got one man who'll do it right." And it was indeed another offer that could not be refused. A change of scenery was the only thing that could help Eric at that moment, and naturally he agreed at once. And after a while, as Anthony Adams expected, he got used to it. Not a year later, as the man began a completely different life, he met his true love, although he put a ban on personal relationships and no longer hoped for anything. Now Eric had everything he could dream of, and really big money, and his own business, which he ran in parallel with the affairs of Anthony Adams, paying tribute for support and help, and a loving wife and mother who had moved in with Braden when Eric finally settled overseas. He never even thought about Madison. But when she found out who Eric had become and how he lived now, she regretted having done that to him. But it was too late to change anything. Those times when Eric had loved her and was willing to do anything for her were irrevocably gone. Now he had a new love. And not a false one, but a real one, fully earned at the cost of betrayal and suffering that could have been avoided if he had opened his eyes a little earlier to the woman who had always been by his side. The wife reluctantly packed her things to leave her husband, but hearing the voices of her husband and mother-in-law, she hid. Carol sat in the stall at her workplace and fell asleep due to the change in weather. She wanted to sleep all the time. The bell rang and a customer appeared near the window. "A scone, please, and 2 poppy seed muffins," the man asked. Carol handed him the purchases and sat back in her seat. Despite such a simple job, she would rather have something physical than sit like this all day, pecking her nose. The customers were good in the morning and from 3 o'clock on, but the rest of the time the woman entertained herself with embroidery or reading books. Carol remembered the 5 years of hard study she had spent at the institute, and now, years later, it turned out that higher education had no meaning for her. After studying, the girl went to work as an engineer at a factory. It closed after 3 years. Carol was disappointed in her future for several years and realized that only in big cities education mattered. The provinces only needed teachers, and for jobs that were distributed in advance to family and friends. Carol didn't stop there. She tried to change a specialty. She finished courses and became a landscape designer. During that period, she met her husband, Daniel. She had high hopes then, which again were not realized. There were few people in the city who were willing to pay specialists to design landscaping projects for plots and gardens. The company promised Carol that they would have projects from the city and possibly the regional administration. But time passed, and apart from the occasional order, nothing happened. Carol urged Daniel to go with her to the regional city, but her fiancé was strongly attached to his parents and didn't want to live in the city. So at almost 32, it seemed to Carol that her life was over. Yes, she married Daniel. They sold Carol's grandmother's old house, added the money given to them as a wedding gift, and took out a loan in her husband's name, as Carol had no official job at the time. Carol's husband did not have a college degree and did not particularly aspire to one. He worked in a warehouse where his mother had gotten him a job many years ago through her connections. Carol tried many things. She even worked at school. But since the girl was adamantly opposed to the system that killed children in schools, She didn't last long there. If someone had told me that I would just waste 5 years of my life, she sighed and put the book aside, I wouldn't have studied anywhere at all. You can learn everything online now. As a child, Carol loved inventing things. Her father taught high school drafting and her mother worked as a doctor. Her parents decided that engineering education would suit Carol, and the girl herself entered the institute with high hopes. Carol dreamed of getting some experience and entering graduate school in a big city, but she quickly had to come back down to earth. She didn't want to stay to teach at the institute. She was interested in practicing. But her parents didn't have the money for her to go where the research centers were located, and counting on a grant at her own institute was pointless because of the low salaries of teachers for many years. In the end, never having become an inventor, she sat in a stall and did not understand what to do next. After a 15 job at the store, Carol found a rather promising place. Of course, the salary wasn't great, but the 8-to-4 schedule with Sunday off suited her. Carol, Hi came from the other side of the window. "How are you doing? Why are you so sad?" "Hi, Kyle," she sighed. "What's there to be happy about? I'll probably never get out of this hole." "But it depends on how you look at it," Carol's former classmate replied seriously. "The glass is half full or empty. That's something only you can determine." Sometimes Carol envied Kyle. He was a head saint in high school, too. His family was very poor. His alcoholic father had drained his mother until he died. And in 11th grade, the kid's mother fell and was left disabled. Kyle's 2 older sisters left for more promising places, and he stayed to look after Alina Alexeyevna. Kyle, like a mom, thoughtfully asked Carol, "Take her a visitor." "You will." "Thank you." He took his bread and a small package from Carol. "Let's keep our spirits up, or you'll find happiness around the corner and you won't be ready for it." "I wish to God I could say that," sighed her classmate. "I'll probably be carried out of this stall." The meeting with Konstantin upset Carol even more, and so forever. But even earlier, Carol decided for the umpteenth time to talk to her husband today. She was sure he wouldn't agree to move from here to somewhere else. Still, the woman decided to give it a try. "What do I want?" she asked herself aloud. "But I'll start with a simple one. Do I want a lot of money?" Unequivocally, no. I want enough so that I don't have to think about not having a penny for bread in a week. I do not need an expensive car or a palace in principle. I need money as a tool for living, not for power and manipulating others. Let's move on. Family. I want children madly. I don't think there's any point in dragging it out any longer. Daniel and I have been married for about 5 years now. We've had enough to live for ourselves. The more Carol reasoned, the more she felt that her problem wasn't even the job. It was a matter of fulfillment. She was suffering from the fact that she couldn't find herself on the outside. Carol saw that she was not living her life. She wasn't realizing her potential at all. "It's your own fault," her mother-in-law often reprimanded her. "If you'd worked at school, everything would have been fine. But no, everyone's happy, but you're not. You're special." Carol put the book aside and surfed the internet again. She loved videos about cold core, single crystal synthesis, and other things that were recognized as pseudoscience. Although it had been proven more than once that it all worked in practice, people's consciousness hadn't yet reached those types of energy. If only we had such a device, we wouldn't need to build dangerous nuclear power plants. "A little box in every yard and everyone would have electricity," Carol whispered, and began to draw something on the paper. "Give me 2 bottles of Budweiser beer." Carol's slightly gruff voice brought Carol back to her senses. She handed over the bread, smiled crookedly. She didn't feel like saying anything back when the bread was already cheaper. The man didn't wait for the saleswoman's reaction and went into action himself. "You've got a nerve, all their own. And bread costs as much as abroad." Carol shrugged her shoulders. She didn't want to get into a discussion. She couldn't influence the pricing in any way. And it was not only pointless, but even dangerous to take all the blame. The customer left, but Carol's mood had completely soured. She started to go home. It was an hour before the stall closed. Carol felt sad again. She dialed her husband. "Hi, how are you doing?" she asked Daniel. "Will you be there today as usual?" "No, I'll be late, maybe a couple hours," he sighed. "There's a shipment coming in late today, and we have to take it in." Carol wasn't in much of a mood to go home. Everything was boring. If she could get away from this life, she'd do it. Tangled in her coat. Despite the wind, she still decided to walk. The beginning of April was cold. There was still snow in some places. Carol walked toward the river. Her hands were cold, but for some reason she was drawn there. The woman approached the bank. Carol suddenly shuddered. "Are you doing something?" Glaring at him with her eyes. "Thinking," he answered calmly. "See," he pointed with his hand at the ice. "Why does it float?" "Well, because water expands when it freezes and becomes lighter." Carol answered at once. "Why does it expand?" He sighed. "No one knows. No one has been able to see how water molecules rearrange themselves into a crystalline structure. Just a moment, and the water in front of us is no longer water, but ice." "Is this a matter of life and death for you?" Carol tried to make a joke. "Yes," Kyle answered seriously. "I've been working on an invention for several years now. I want to create a substance that would restore the structure of Mom's hip bone." "What does ice have to do with it?" Carol couldn't understand. "You want to put it on the sore spot?" "No, I want a liquid that can expand when it hits the bone tissue, and thus create a porous bone structure. After my mom's fracture, all of her bones are flattened." "Honestly, I can't even imagine how that would be possible," Carol thought. "If you inject this fluid into the muscle, the body temperature will prevent it from changing structure. Therefore, this fluid in its original state must exist at a higher temperature." His eyes lit up. "I've already gotten it, but I don't have time to inject it yet. It's already getting viscous in the syringe." "You amaze me," Carol whispered in amazement. "But I still don't understand how it can be done." "The idea is this: I inject a certain substance, and at body temperature it becomes viscous and expands. I need to inject it near the problem bone. Then this substance will lift the bone tissue a little bit and keep it that way for a certain period of time. The bone tissue regenerates quickly and a new healthy area appears. About a week to 2 weeks later, the substance breaks down into water and other safe elements." "But if you look at it all theoretically," Carol lit up, "then you need an inhibitor to slow down the solidification of this substance ahead of time. Although I still don't believe it can be done." The conversation with Kyle was a real jolt to the woman. What Kyle was doing seemed more miraculous than real to her. But let's say such a substance existed and could be administered. She pondered on the way home. How would it determine that it needed to work on bone and not other tissue? Carol got home and began to do her chores. But Kyle and his idea never left her mind. She was grasping at it like a straw, you might say. It had been so long since Carol's mind had solved such complex problems that the woman had taken a keen interest in the whole thing. Late in the afternoon, her husband returned. Carol's eyes were burning. She wanted to tell him everything. "Daniel, do you remember my classmate Kyle?" She spoke quickly. "Well, he's doing something so interesting right now. He wants to invent a drug to cure his mother." What a load of crap. Daniel made a disgruntled face. He's had her for over 10 years with a fractured femoral neck. "People can't get up. She's gonna die, you idiot." Why is he an idiot? The wife took offense. Maybe he can do something. Many inventions were created by amateurs, not professionals. Because he's an idiot. The man said unkindly, "I've seen your Kyle. It's written all over his face that he's a worthless man. I don't agree with you, the wife countered. Kyle doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he works. He's a decent man. He's lazy. Daniel waved his hand. Don't spoil the mood. I don't want to talk about this garbage. Daniel sat down at the table. Not that Daniel was any different from anyone else, but in his mind he was a real man. Of course, everyone in the neighborhood knew that Kyle was taking care of his mother. Many people found such things surprising, but didn't like it. Daniel himself had also lived across town with his mother before he got married. Carol and Daniel were able to buy a home inexpensively in this area of town that was considered the most up and coming. Daniel, let's go somewhere else. Carol couldn't take it anymore. I can't live here anymore. I'm not leaving my mother, I warned you right away, he replied. Maybe she'll move in with us later too, Carol tried again. No, she wants to stay here. And Carol, well, don't you start. Go to work at the school, and your ardor will diminish immediately. In the beginning of their acquaintance, Carol felt like she was behind Daniel like a stone wall. But after a few years, she began to notice that her husband was not inclined to talk openly or to change. He was a very closed, conservative man, even though he didn't realize it. Carol suffered greatly from this. She could be called sociable, and at first the girl was sure that she could find a common language with Daniel. But time showed that she wouldn't. Okay, Daniel, if you don't want to leave here, then let's plan a baby. Where else can we wait, she raged. That's something you and I will discuss later, he replied coldly. Carol, will you let me have a quiet evening? I'm tired. There was nothing left for Carol to do but forget everything and do some business. How often do young people fall in love? They think their love will last forever. But time passes, and both begin to notice that they have not chosen the most suitable partner. And it becomes scary. Why is it so? Everything was great in the beginning. Unfortunately, each of us enters marriage not with a real person, but with our own expectations. So when our expectations are not met, we begin to see our partner as he or she really is. And of course, the reality is very different from the desired reality. Someone begins to work on himself, and the relationship improves or people break up. But such a minority. The rest try their best to maintain the standards imposed on them and go on with their lives. That's what Carol thought, that now she would have to die with Daniel on the same day. Carol went to sleep again, such an impenetrable darkness enveloping her. She cast a glance at her husband and shuddered. He seemed foreign and distant to her. The next day was warmer. Carol didn't even turn on the heater. It began as it always did, first the receiving of goods, and then the customers crowded around her stall. Carol tried to smile at them, but she wasn't in the mood. She saw a picture in front of her that she had taken a wrong turn. Her parents didn't get involved in her daughter's life, and she couldn't talk to them. They, too, held views that were considered normal in society. By the end of the day, Carol realized that she was dying to talk to Kyle. But he was coming in every other day for bread. He wasn't officially working anywhere. He couldn't leave his mother all day. He worked part-time, did odd jobs, hired out to neighbors. None of his older sisters wanted to take on such a burden. So the man got by as best he could. The phone rang. Daniel said he was staying at his mother's house tonight. Carol knew the routine very well. Daniel had a difficult temper. He couldn't calm down for a long time, so after such conversations with his wife, he often spent the night at his mother's house, so as not to bring the matter to conflict. Perhaps it was Carol's own fault. If she caught fire, she couldn't stop until she got some result. And since it seemed to the woman that her happiness depended on moving to another city, or having a baby, she wanted to see this through to the end. All right, the wife replied through tears. Daniel, she wanted to say something to him, but refrained. I'll miss you. It had been a lonely evening. It drove Carol further into a state of hopelessness. She felt like tearing up and throwing up. Maybe get a job in the area. An idea came to her mind. I won't be able to take it anytime soon. Daniel will never leave his mother. Daniel's father had died a year and a half ago. Now he was all the more reluctant to even think about another city. He was fine here. His mother was alone and needed looking after. Only unlike Kyle, Daniel felt like he was acting like a grown man. I'm doing something wrong, Carol sighed. It's like I'm walking in a vicious circle. There's no way out. It seemed she saw a dead end in every area of her life. The only thing that occurred to her then was to take a few days off for a few days off for a few days and just not think about anything. The next day was Friday, and the woman called the landlord first thing in the morning. He agreed to give her a couple days. Carol rejoiced when she saw her classmate. But how are you doing? How are your experiments going? Well, some things are, he reported cheerfully. Honestly, there isn't enough time. I'd so like to see it, Carol admitted. I can't believe it's possible. How does this substance reach the bone? Hey, I certainly don't understand it myself, the man shrugged. It's just that if it stays in the tissue, it starts breaking down right away. I did experiments on my dog. Rex ran outside one night. He was mauled by other dogs. After some time, I tried to inject him near the sore spot, but there was no result. He healed all by himself. Then why do you think it works on bone tissue? The classmate couldn't figure it out. And that's where the same Rex helped me again, laughed the man. Only now that restless dog was being pounded by someone. Anyway, he came back with a broken paw. I gave him shots, didn't even think anything would work. But to my surprise, after 3 days he could walk. I touched his leg and the bone had fused. I gave him another injection. And within a week he was running like before. I don't have lab equipment, so I can't tell you exactly how it all works. But right now it seems to me that this substance first expands the bone tissue and then absorbs into it, promoting regeneration. You want to come over and I'll show you? Kyle offered and started to pay because a couple more people came up behind him. Are you going to be home tomorrow? Carol shouted out from the stall. Kyle nodded affirmatively and waved at her. Despite the problems, I find Kyle's life much more interesting than mine. Carol sighed and began serving customers. And there was something about it all. Perhaps Carol's passion for scientific knowledge, an interest in learning something new. But she did go to Kyle's house the next day. Carol talked to her classmate's mother. She had seen her years ago, and it was obvious now how much the woman was suffering. Kyle dressed her, taking her for a walk outside. So, shall we go see it? He winked cheerfully at his guest. I'll warn you right away, my place is a mess. They entered the workshop. Yes, it was a place of sheer chaos, but it made Carol's blood boil. How happy was she to see all those scattered tools, flasks, coasters, checks, bits of different metals. Wow, her eyes lit up. Kyle, you've got a real lab in here. I'm the one with the mess right now. And when I start the process, it's sterile clean here on the table. The man led her over to a very strange setup. There were some tubes connected there, vessels through which some kind of gas was apparently being pumped. And how does all this work? She asked in amazement. Is it something organic? Well, of course, no hydrocarbons around here. Kyle smiled and began to explain to Carol how his device worked. But that was only the first part. The main part was the substance it produced. That was where all the value was. Have you tried injecting your mom with it yet? Carol asked cautiously. Carol was afraid. I'm scared too, he sighed. He had recently picked up 2 stray dogs with broken paws. So now I'm treating them. Wow, caught her guest's breath. It's working. She kept her eyes on her host. Yes, he sighed. But I want to add one more component. My intuition tells me the effectiveness might increase that way. Kyle, have you told your mom about your experiments? Carol inquired. She wants to try it, he replied seriously. Mom is already very tired of her disability. I feel very sorry for her, too. Yes, the case is too delicate. There are great risks. Little chance of anything? Maybe such a drug would work for dogs, but not for humans, sighed a classmate. That's the problem, Kyle supported her. It's not like I'm a scientist. I don't have that kind of knowledge. Sure, I've reread tons of books, even consulted with some experts. But I can't say out loud that it works. Kyle. Well, if it does work, what then? Curiosity was shared by Carol. But I'm not Henry Ford. I don't have a wife, Clara, who supported him no matter what. And the light saw the world's first automobile, the man sighed. But if it does come out that way, I'll be happy for those people who will have the opportunity to have real bones instead of titanium bones. So what? A lot of handicapped people will walk normally. Carol walked home. She wanted to cry and rejoice at the same time. Why cry? Because people like Kyle never asked for anything from anyone. They were altruistic and tried to bring something to people at the expense of themselves. Well, joy was a natural feeling from the fact that among the heart-centered people were these fools like her classmate. Daniel and his kind would never put such simpletons in line with themselves. It would be beneath their dignity. But it was Kyle, not him, who sought to improve the lives of all mankind. He used his last dime to buy the necessary drugs, assembling rig after rig until he got exactly what he wanted. These are the kind of people who just move science forward. They're real men with pumped-up brains, not bodies. The latter didn't matter much, except for the physical labor. There were many, many things going through Carol's mind. She, too, wanted to quit everything and do something, to invest her energies, to dream that something would work out, instead of sitting in her stall and being angry at life. Carol was in no mood at all, so she didn't call her husband. She felt a strong resentment toward him. Compared to Kyle, he looked retarded. His outlook on life showed that he didn't have much intelligence in him. She distracted herself with household chores. Her husband came home from work in the evening. He was kind of wooden. Daniel, is something wrong? His wife walked up to him. You look exhausted. Yeah, there was trouble at work today, he tossed off and went into the other room. Carol didn't bother him, but there was pain in her soul again. Daniel seemed like a complete stranger to her. The weekend flew by quickly and Carol went back to work. The morning didn't go well. First, some grandfather got into a fight with her, always telling her that she'd stolen from him. In his opinion, she should have taken half as much bread from him. Grandpa, do I have to add the rest of you out of my own pocket? Carol answered him. You're smoking everyone here, yelled an old man outside the stall. Whatever price you want, that's what you charge. Old age is no fun, said an elderly woman nearby. It takes away everything, even your mind. The grandfather kept yelling, threatening to report him to the police when the saleswoman stopped paying attention to him. Hello, Carol, the longtime acquaintance approached the stall with a wry smile. She had no idea how much Carol hated her, and the feeling was mutual. Hello, Lucy. The woman replied calmly. You, as always, she did not want to prolong the conversation. She and Lucy had once worked together at the school. The latter stayed there, worked her way up to head teacher, and thought she had become a celestial. Well, since Carol was openly opposed to the school system, she was laughed at by the likes of Lucy. They made a good profit at the school, with some of the curtain money going into their pockets. And the rates for expensive gifts were set at the beginning of the school year. I heard you and Daniel divorced. Lucy lowered her voice. Why were they so out of character? What the hell is that? Carol's eyes flashed. We're fine, we're still together. But that chick he keeps driving around in his car is nothing like you. Lucy laughed out loud. I heard it was someone from his work. It's not like his mom gave him a girl. Is there anything else you need? Or is that it? Carol tossed it to her. Sorry, I got a lot of work to do. Yeah, she said dismissively. The truth hurts. She grabbed the bag of muffins and walked away. Of course, Lucy's words had hurt Carol. She trusted her husband. Yes, he was occasionally late for work, but that didn't mean anything. Idiot, Carol whispered. You'd better look at yourself, stolen money. Daddy's pockets are howling. No matter how much Carol urged herself not to think about the incident, all sorts of thoughts popped into her head. Meanwhile, Daniel was having a serious conversation. It was break time, and he went into the back room to see Lenora. The woman pretended not to pay attention to him. Daniel approached her, wanting to hug her. Don't touch me. She waved him away. I told you it's over between us. Len, stop it. I love you, he said in a gentle voice. I broke up with my ex, she sobbed. Are you still living with her? I just don't know how to file for divorce so that I can get the house back. I paid the loan on it, the man sighed. You wouldn't even listen to me yesterday, Lenora said. I don't care, the mistress didn't want to reconcile. You promised me that she wouldn't be in my life anymore. She sobbed. I can tell you that again, he confirmed. You give me time. When Daniel had met Carol, he'd thought he'd found his ideal. The girl seemed smart, reliable. Of course, the young man had serious relationships before her, but he had not yet decided to marry. Daniel always considered himself one of the most real men. When he was young, he enthusiastically pumped his muscles. In his opinion, he wasn't stupid either. In short, the perfect man. After a year of married life, Carol and her high-mindedness began to annoy him. Daniel didn't want to waste his time with such nonsense. All this talk about life, about how to make it better for everyone. It wasn't for him. Well, and then, about 3 years later, when Carol had developed a bent on moving to the city, the young man finally realized that he'd done something wrong. It wasn't Daniel's policy to admit his mistakes. A real man couldn't make mistakes. But a couple more months passed, and Daniel clearly realized that something had to be done. He'd had his eye on one at work a long time ago. Lenora was living with Wade at the time. She was a beautiful and hard-working woman, so Daniel began to pursue her. They hid at first. Daniel had a car, so it was easy. Then Daniel started making jealous scenes to get his lover to break up with her roommate. Basically nothing new. A word or two about Daniel's mother. It's not that Tracy hated Carol. No, it's just that she'd always felt she was the wrong kind of wife for Daniel. Carol wasn't exactly a looker. Her overly skinny body and salt black hair didn't evoke the emotions that usually came from seeing a beautiful woman. And when Tracy learned that her son was looking at Lenora, she didn't mind at all. Carol's fate had been decided behind her back. She'd hoped she and her husband would go to the big city and have children. Lenora clung to her lover, wanting certainty. And for that, Daniel had to go through with the divorce. The sooner the better. The man himself couldn't stand his wife anymore either. She had become repugnant to him. Daniel, in the evening, Carol came up to him and said, I want to talk to you. She was very worried. Not tonight, he objected immediately. Carol, may I? Did you get any sleep tonight? I still can't get over last night. Daniel. I can't take it anymore, she shouted. You're not paying attention to me. What's the matter? It's nothing, he threw coldly. I'm tired. It's not like I'm a robot. I can't take a day off on a whim like you do. Do you love me? The wife asked provocatively. Carol, answer me, did you decide to finish me off today? After all, jumped the husband out of bed and began to dress. Where are you going? Carol rushed to him in tears. To my mother's, at least to sleep at her place. She doesn't nag me as much as you do. He said goodbye and disappeared into the yard. During the night, Carol was restless. The next day in the evening, she decided to drive to her husband's work. She waited till morning. It was gray, unkind. The work was hard. There weren't many people because it was raining. Carol closed her stall and hailed a cab. She tangled herself in her raincoat and waited. Daniel worked until 6. His wife waited for him, stood nearby and watched as her husband came out of the gate, followed by some strange woman. She sat in the front seat and began kissing him passionately. Carol couldn't move. She sat down and cried loudly. The car had long since left and she still couldn't get up. "Daniel," she called her husband an hour later, "we need to have a serious talk with you. I've seen you. So stop making a fool of me." Her husband was silent, disconnecting the phone. Carol tried many more times to dial him, but he blocked her number. "Bastard," Carol screamed. "What a coward you turned out to be. You've never been a real man, only lip service, just shaking your muscles senselessly." Carol was exhausted that night. She hadn't slept much the night before to do anything about it. She took a sedative, fell asleep. She woke up to the phone ringing, her alarm clock going off. She could barely get up. No sooner had she opened her stall than Kyle came rushing toward her on his bike. He looked very excited. "Carol, I did it," he said. "I gave Mom her first shot, and she's feeling better." "Congratulations," she said dryly. She was in so much pain she didn't want to see anyone. "Did something happen to you?" Carol's classmate tossed his bike. "It's nothing much," she said through tears. "It's just that I'm going to be filing for divorce." "Did you and Daniel have a fight?" As if he wanted to be supportive of his friend. "Carol, I can help you with that." "Kyle? With what?" She covered her face with her hands. "Will you make me forget that he has a mistress and that he cheated on me? Here you go, give this to your mom." She held out some buns in a bag. "Come over tonight after work," Kyle suggested. "You need a detached look at all this." Carol didn't say anything back to him, shrugging her shoulders. She just wanted to stop living at that moment. Daniel still didn't answer either. Carol called her parents, explaining everything to them. "Carol, get your things and come and visit us," her mother told her immediately. "How I didn't want your Daniel. He thought too highly of himself." And so he was. Not a man, but a wimp. Can't even admit his betrayal. And Daniel was actually very nervous. That was the real reason he hadn't filed for divorce yet. He didn't want to be seen as a scumbag in other people's eyes. But how to frame his wife? He hadn't figured it out until now. Now everyone would know he had a mistress. At work, they'd somehow managed to keep it quiet until the last moment. Daniel's mother had made up a legend that Lenora was a distant relative of theirs. And so Daniel often gave her a ride home. They never took liberties in public at the warehouse, and they rarely spoke at all. So from this side, Daniel looked like a decent family man and took care of his relatives. Tracy was often late for work. Then the three of them would drive home. Daniel swore the last words at Carol to himself. He really didn't want the gossip. Everything was going according to plan. His mother had promised to help him get rid of his wife. Carol seemed to feel her husband cursing her. She walked toward the house, but then abruptly turned around and headed to visit Kyle. Carol greeted her classmate's mother cheerfully. "It's so good to see you." The guest froze in place. She couldn't believe her eyes. No, Lenora wasn't walking yet, but she looked much better. "Can you imagine? The pains are gone," she reported contentedly. "I was so scared, and Kyle was too." "Carol, but what have I got to lose? 5 more years of being in a wheelchair and then going to the other side of the world. I'm still afraid to believe in that miracle." Carol and Kyle walked to the workshop. The man sat down in a chair. He was overwhelmed with emotion, such joy that he couldn't even express it. "Carol, I consulted someone," Kyle began. "True, it's not a doctor, it's a biochemist. But anyway, he told me it's a very promising field. Something like growing bones, only not from stem cells, but from the cells of the bone itself. First, this substance fills the problematic joint. Then it expands the space a little bit and starts to fit into it. This somehow provokes the growth of new cells. I don't even know how to explain it scientifically. "Do you want to continue your experiment?" Carol inquired. "Carol, it seems very promising to me. I'd have to get my mother back on her feet," he sighed. "Serious research takes money, and I don't have any. I'm already denying myself everything to buy everything I need. I even needed high-grade gold for the rig." "But if you get a patent," Carol suggested, "then you could implement your invention." "Who's going to give it to me? That takes serious research, not knee-jerk like mine. If I could find sponsors. But in our city, it is simply impossible. We either have beggars like me or businessmen in the market. And these comrades are not interested in their future anyway. They don't even want a better life for their children. They live for one day, just to make more money." And yet Carol had the feeling that something would change. She returned home in high spirits. She felt like her life was making sense to her now. Carol was eager to study with Kyle, and the first thing she wanted to do was contact someone at her institute for advice. One faculty member she had once been good friends with, but that would come later. For now, the woman needed to pack her things and move in with her parents. Carol saw that her husband wasn't home. She rushed into one of the rooms and started packing her bags. The pain came over her again, and she dropped everything and lay down on the bed to calm down. Then she heard a noise. She threw her bag into the closet and hid in the corner behind the curtain. She didn't want to see Daniel so badly that some childish instinct kicked in. Someone was talking at the door, and Carol immediately recognized her mother-in-law and her husband. "Just throw my jewelry in her drawer," Tracy was saying. "And then I'll file a police report. Let them know I suspect her. Your wife turned out to be a thief. I mean, she's been visiting me, and everyone knows it." Carol opened the door, turned on the recording on her phone. The husband and mother-in-law were so startled they couldn't get a word out. "So that's it," Carol angrily threw. "Not only did you scoundrels confuse me, but you also wanted to slander me. But no more. Listen here. Everyone will know what you are and what your son is, and he's no different from you. He's a bastard like you." "Shut your mouth," Daniel lunged at her. "I'll have you now," he swung around. "Everything that happens here is seen by Kyle on his phone. He bugged me." Carol made up a story as she went along. "So any movement you make and the police will be right there." Daniel ran out of the house, followed by his mother. Carol, of course, hadn't heard that Tracy wasn't going to have her son share the house with her, as that was a topic they had discussed before the jewelry was planted. Her mother-in-law's jewelry would become a tool for their blackmail. Carol would then easily give up her share. Daniel thus accomplished two things at once. He got out clean, because now Carol was to blame for the divorce. And secondly, he was taking all the property. He pulled up sharply in front of his mother's yard. She got out and he drove to his mistress. "How I hate you so much," he whispered. "Stupid, you ruined everything." He pounded his fist on the steering wheel. Daniel stepped on the gas. He only had a couple of kilometers to go to get to Lenore. But a corner appeared, and Daniel suddenly slammed into a pole at full speed. The car was a pile of metal in an instant. Everything swirled before Daniel's eyes, and he lost consciousness. "No," screamed Tracy Alexandra as her son was overtaken by instant punishment. She walked around with crazy eyes and told everyone how her daughter-in-law had cast a spell on her and Daniel. She wanted to kill him, found a lover, and thought to get rid of my boy that way. How are such people incapable of admitting their guilt? And Tracy Alexandra has always been convinced of her uniqueness. Mistakes are for the weak. That's how she raised her son. He could look down on everyone forever, make fun of others. But there's always a price. Daniel came to. His mother was sitting beside him, crying. She had already argued with all the doctors, demanding that her son be brought back to life. though she had been warned that if Daniel did regain consciousness, he would most likely remain disabled. I mean, how's that no walking? Tracy Alexander jumped up from her chair in the doctor's office. It's your responsibility to get him on his feet. But I'm not the Lord God, replied the doctor. Besides, you can arrange in New York for money to have him operated on. We don't do such complicated operations in our city. There are no such specialists. So it's up to you. Tracy Alexander shouted at the entire hospital, threatening the prosecutor's office. Come on, bring the prosecutor. I'll show him in what conditions we work. Maybe they will at least raise our salaries. Calmly replied the doctor. Tracy Alexandra was shaking, but she didn't realize that the doctors had already done everything they could. Daniel had survived, and already that could be called a miracle. After a few days, they allowed his mistress to visit the patient. She cried, and then decided to talk to the doctor. Are you sure that nothing can be done? I beg you, maybe we can find some kind of cure. Unfortunately, there is no such magic pill, the doctor sighed. Prepare for the worst. He won't walk. He has serious problems with his spine. The mistress fell to the floor. She hadn't counted on this outcome at all. Lenora found herself in a very difficult position. For almost a week, she thought about her future, and then she made a decision. Wade. Hi, she dialed her ex-boyfriend. I'm so sorry, Lenora cried, fake tears. I only love you. Let's get back together. Tracy Alexandra was also thinking hard. She was counting on Lenora in this situation. Daniel would get the house and the divorce. So they already had a place to live, she reasoned. I would visit them from time to time, help her out. The next day at Tracy's work, Alexandra wanted to have a serious talk with Daniel's mistress. Lenora, can I talk to you for a minute? She approached her. My girl, I don't think you're going to have any more problems with housing. You and Daniel can stay at his place or yours. It's just that if you take him in, you can sell the house and pay for the treatment. The doctor said he might get his back working and my boy will at least be able to ride in a wheelchair. Lenora laughed. Tracy Alexandra, you'll have to excuse me, but I can't. Somehow going pale, break Daniel. Lenora, are you abandoning my son? I mean, he loves you so much. Tracy Alexandra. You see, Wade came back to me, she smiled crookedly. So we're living together now. You took him back, Tracy Alexandra whispered. Lenora, how could you do that? And my boy. She sobbed. But Lenora wasn't about to change her plans. As long as Daniel had been healthy, everything had been fine. But now that he was an invalid, why would she want to ruin her life? Loving someone else is important, of course. But you can't love yourself any less. It's always me that comes first for people like Lenora. It was very hard for Tracy Alexandra to admit defeat. Things had spiraled so fast she'd forgotten all about her sister-in-law. But it was getting to her. The few times she'd gotten to Daniel's house, his wife hadn't been home. What am I going to tell her? Tracy Alexandra was working out a plan in her head. It's not like she's going to listen to me. I have to come up with something so she can't say no to me. The mother drove to her son's house almost every day. She was tired of running back and forth. Mom, why isn't Lenora coming? Daniel asked her one day. Why don't you ask her to come over and see me? I miss her. Daniel, she said as gently as possible. Do you understand? And Lenora's gone. Her mom's sick, so she has to live in the village for now. Tracy Alexandra realized that she couldn't tell Daniel yet that Lenora had left him. It might make things worse for him. Mom, call her, he asked. Please. I want to hear her voice so badly. Tracy Alexandra was confused. She left the room and dialed Lenora. I'm begging you, well, play along with him, she cried. If he finds out now that you left him, God forbid. Well, okay, I'll say a few words to him. And that's it, the ex-lover replied angrily. If Wade finds out, he'll kill me. Lenora wasn't as affectionate as she'd been before. But Daniel was somewhat relieved. "Mom, did you see her?" His face turned contemptuous. "I don't even want to bring her up, but we need to settle on a house. I think I'll be divorced easily now. I'll probably recover for another 6 months, and then I'll go back to work." My mother didn't say anything. She knew that it would be impossible to realize all his dreams. "Okay, I'll talk to her," she sighed. "Daniel, let's talk about this later, after you've been discharged." Tracy Alexandra urgently needed to get Carol back. Hanging her disabled son around her neck was not for her. In words alone, Tracy Alexandra could be the perfect mother, but spending the rest of her old age caring for a sick person was too much. Carol was screaming all over the house. She couldn't take it anymore. She'd never met such mean people before. She was putting her things in a bag. In fact, Carol was in such an agitated state that she could not control herself. Finally, her hysteria ended and tears were shed. After that, the woman felt lighter. "I hate it," she whispered. Carol carried some bags outside and hailed a cab. Her mother had already called several times. She was frantically worried about her daughter. No sooner had Carol laid out her things than she was called. "Yes," she said angrily. She had no time to talk. The phone interrogated her first and last name. "Your husband was in an accident?" She was suddenly informed. "He's in intensive care. The chances are slim." Carol was numb. She couldn't even believe what she was hearing at first. "Mom, he was in an accident," she said quietly, and rushed over to her. Of course, Carol was very angry with Daniel, but she didn't wish him dead. "Are you going to go to him?" Mom asked. Her daughter immediately shook her head negatively. "Mom, what's the point of all this? He doesn't love me. He has a mistress. Let her worry about him." Carol wiped away her tears. Be that as it may, Carol still wanted to visit her husband, but she held herself in check. Why? She was talking to someone in her head. If he doesn't want me, she still had feelings for Daniel, and Carol couldn't hide it. But in the situation they were all in, her coming would have looked just plain stupid even in her own eyes. She had to deal with her feelings on her own. Still, she'd talked to Daniel's doctor. She drove to the hospital early one morning before work. "He'll remain disabled," the doctor said. "How's the verdict?" "Unfortunately, there is serious damage to his spine." Since Carol now lived far from where she worked, she, like many in her town, rode her bicycle. Hi, Kyle rode up to her. "Carol, come see us if you can. Really need your advice, Carol. Daniel's been in an accident." She couldn't stand it and cried. "He's going to be an invalid now." "You're going back to him now?" Consternation showed on Kyle's face. Carol noticed how his voice trembled. "No," she shook her head negatively. "He has another woman, and he doesn't care about me at all." The man picked up the bread and pastries and went about his business. Carol watched him go. Yes, the old jacket Kyle seemed to have worn as a teenager, the shoes with holes in them. As a classmate had told her, he didn't spend the money from his mother's pension, and that's what they lived on. And whatever he managed to earn or sell, he put into his rig. "Why is that?" Carol sighed. "Those who live only for themselves prosper, and those who do their best for others are dragging out a miserable existence in poverty like this." Despite the pain, Carol decided to go out and accept her friend's invitation. It had been almost 2 weeks since Kyle had first administered the medicine to her mother. They hadn't seen each other much since then. Kyle said he had been very busy with work the whole time. Carol walked into her friend's house. He was smiling. It was obvious that he knew about something, and the guests obviously had no idea about it. The woman entered the room and froze in place. Standing by the window was Kyle's mother on crutches. "God, how is this possible?" she whispered. come out, Kyle walked toward her. Amber Adams demonstrated a few tentative steps. Carol looked at Kyle in bewilderment. Is this a joke? She was overwhelmed with emotion. Kyle, you can't believe it. It's true. He walked over to his mother and hugged her. Well, I'll tell you honestly, if Mom recovers, we'll certainly lose something, he laughed. But I'm willing to work and compensate Mom for her pension. I'll go to work myself. If I move normally, right away, the woman replied. For so many years, I don't want to sit any longer. The young people chatted till nearly 3 o'clock. This event was a big deal to both of them. Then Kyle walked Carol home. Or rather, they rode their bikes home together. And then he came home. Carol went to bed. She thought about the patience and stamina it took not to break down like that. And Kyle, he said, had been failing for years. He'd quit for a couple months, and then, it would be like an impulse from inside him to get up. He'd get back on track, her friend told her. Carol herself felt that now that she was free, she could do something useful. She would really like to support Kyle first. If I could find someone interested. She sighed. Then Kyle would have a chance at life. If he paid good money for the patent, it could be enough for him for years to come. Maybe someone else would invest in the invention. He had so many ideas. But again, it all came down to finances. The teacher Carol contacted told her right away that government organizations were unlikely to be interested in such a thing. They wanted everything for free. So you have to look for someone from serious businessmen. And where will you find them, these businessmen? She whispered frustratedly. It's one thing to be in New York, but it's another to be in a province like this. The next day prepared new adventures for Carol. Around 10, Tracy's mother-in-law, Alexandra, approached her stall. Panting with anger, Carol tried to be as friendly as possible. We could talk to you, she smiled for emphasis. Carol thought it would be about the divorce or the division of the apartment, since those were still open to her. So she agreed. There were no visitors, and the woman stepped outside. She crossed her arms over her chest and waited. Carol, her mother-in-law, sighed. You misunderstood us last time. You see, she seduced my son. It was obvious she was struggling with every word. Anyway, she's been blackmailing him, threatening Daniel. She's got some man. I'm pretty sure he's the one who beat up my son 3 days before that accident. Lenora stated that if Daniel didn't bring her gold jewelry as a gift, Tracy Alexandra held her handkerchief to her mouth. My son would be stabbed to death. We wanted to make it look like you had my jewelry that she wanted. Like you'd taken it. Carol clearly sensed that her mother-in-law was trying to put her in a state of pity for her and Daniel. She even began to sympathize with her husband. Emotions overwhelmed her and she stopped thinking rationally. Okay, stop, she said to either herself or Tracy Alexandra. Now, don't make a fool of me. I wonder how it's possible to blackmail a man into sleeping with someone. That can only happen by free will. Did she tie him up, rape him? Tracy Alexandra was silent. She tried to catch a single sensible thought in her head, but she was having none of it. Carol, but I'm begging you. You don't leave him. Daniel loves you very much. He keeps asking, when are you going to visit him? I'm begging you. Her mother-in-law was still looking at her. But as far as I'm concerned, your son doesn't want a mistress. And you do now, Carol laughed. I'm always amazed at people like that. How can you be such a creature? I mean, you're nothing. How loudly you shouted, my Daniel, what's the problem? So you look after him yourself. Carol, well, you must realize that I'm not young anymore, she said in an angelic voice. I don't have the strength to visit him. One thought occurred to Carol, and that would be the last thing she would do for him. Tracy Alexandra cheered up. She didn't understand what Carol was talking about then, and Carol wouldn't talk to her again. To her delight, people approached. Tracy Alexandra almost sent her an air kiss out of joy. After work, Carol drove to Kyle's house. He was tinkering in the workshop as usual. Sitting on the bench was Amber Adams. She was happy, smiling, and greeted Carol. "Oh, look, I walked with crutches. Much better today," she said. Carol hugged her with delight. Kyle watched them from the sidelines. He was very pleased that his mother liked Carol. "Shall we go?" He waved to his guest. "There's something else I want to show you." "Kyle, could you help me?" Carol asked seriously. "Do you think your stuff could help Daniel?" "Well," he scratched his head, "I can't say for sure. But if you think about it theoretically, yes. I mean, Mom's bones are regenerating, and so are tendons and nerve connections." "Could you help him?" Carol looked hopefully into his eyes. "If he agrees." "All right," Kyle answered without much enthusiasm. "I'll do it for you." Carol didn't pay much attention to his last words. It wasn't that she wanted to go on living with Daniel, but she clearly felt that she had to give him the chance. "Thank you," Carol suddenly ran up to the man and kissed him on the cheek. Kyle blushed. He went out of his workshop under the pretense of taking something, rushed into his room, and collapsed on his bed. He was very afraid that someone might find out about his secret. "Well, are you ready?" After a minute, he entered the workshop again. "Carol, come on, look at this." He opened an old notebook with yellowed pages. "This is a plate that is supposed to generate special radiations. Its power is small, but unlike those that now exist, such radiation should deliver the drug to the bloodstream without any interference." "Are you saying that it is possible to somehow transfer the medicine into a vein without a syringe?" Carol opened her mouth in surprise, but Kyle was pleased with her reaction. "Carol, it's all about the radiation. It sort of takes the particles of any drug and delivers them to the right place. Rex has already experienced the benefits of this new method." Carol laughed. What was Oscar injecting him with? He was very pleased by the way Kyle laughed. "It's all about the plate. It requires a special alloy. Then I coated it several times with different liquids. I have another idea. But it would require special equipment, very thin plates of quartz with other materials layered on top of them. I definitely can't do that here. The plate that I have, so far, delivers only 50 to 60% of the drug. So that's a start, too." Carol looked at this thin, unremarkable man and marveled at his intelligence. He spoke so simply about such serious things, talking about his mistakes and unprofessionalism. "Kyle, you're a genius." Carol couldn't take it anymore. She kept her eyes on him. The man blushed. "I don't know anything at all," he mumbled. "There are such luminaries, I'm no match for them." "You're wrong," he said, and that struck a nerve with her. "I'm proud to have you as a friend, and I'm sure you'll accomplish a lot." "I'd like to get my mom back on her feet," he said sadly. "Of course, it's a miracle what's happening now. But I'd like to see her walking freely in the yard, growing her favorite flowers." "Kyle, I want to get her something." Carol's eyes lit up. "I'll bring her some seedlings and some flower seeds." "I don't know anything about that," he smiled. "I'd really appreciate it if you'd look into it." It was one of the best evenings they had ever had as friends. Kyle saw Carol off. Late. "Carol, thank you." A friend said goodbye to her. "I wouldn't have succeeded if it weren't for your support. I really appreciate it." He lowered his head. "Kyle, you're a very good friend too, and I feel like you underestimate yourself," Carol replied. Carol touched his hair. Kyle got on his iron horse and rode toward home. His heart was singing. It was May outside. The next day, Carol wanted to go to her husband's house from work. Of course, there was great anger in her heart, but she realized that she would never take revenge, especially not if Kyle's drug could help him. There were no harmful substances in it. Any doctor would have said it wouldn't work. But as Kyle himself had said, it wasn't so much the composition that was the main thing here, but the process of getting it. Carol tossed the guests into her bag, got on her bike. She didn't know how she was going to talk to Daniel, or even if the dialogue would take place. Carol waited a moment to catch her breath. She went over in her head what she was going to say to her husband. She looked into the room, and there was nothing there. That was the most important thing. Carol really didn't want to meet her mother-in-law. And Daniel was awake. You could tell by the look on his face that he was thinking about something. Lenora had told him that she wouldn't be coming to see him in the next few months. Daniel got some kind of strange premonition. "What are you doing here?" he asked his wife in horror. His cheekbones shifted nervously. "Go away. I don't want to see you." "Daniel, let's talk to you," Carol said calmly. "We're adults." "This is all your fault. Is it your fault that I'm lying here right now?" Daniel accused his wife. "Daniel, come on. You know that's a lie." She tried to calm him down. "I can help you." He laughed to devalue Carol. "You've accomplished nothing in your life except your stall. Kyle invented a special drug that helps your bones get back to normal. It's perfectly safe," the wife began. "I don't want to hear about that quack. Although I'm not surprised you cheated on me with him. You're both assholes." Daniel shouted, drool flying from his mouth. "Get out, Tahir. I wish Kyle would die sooner. That penniless hobo on his prehistoric bicycle." "Daniel," he lifted his mother. "She's been in a wheelchair for years. This is your chance." Carol tried to ignore his profanity. "Go away," Daniel shouted, and his red face said he was in a very emotional state. A nurse came running in and asked her guest to leave. Carol saw Daniel turning his head from one side to the other and shouting something. "What did his pumped-up body give him?" sighed the wife. "His psyche is so weak that his muscles could never compensate for that loss." Carol was genuinely sorry that Daniel had refused her help. She realized that it was unlikely that his mother would mess around with him. She'd already hinted at it when they'd met. "It's his choice," Carol whispered. "I did the best I could. His accident wasn't my fault. I never cheated on him." 2 days later, Carol's mother-in-law came to work again. She was no longer asking her to go back to her son. "Carol, I think you need to take Daniel's situation seriously," she said. "I'm asking you to give him the house. I can't cure him on my own." "Okay," Carol agreed. "But on one condition: you'll never be in my life again." Tracy Alexandra agreed. After the tantrum her son had thrown at her about Carol, she had no more requests or complaints for her. When Daniel's mother started this game, she felt like a real queen. But every game comes to an end sooner or later. And the one who seemed at the beginning to have every chance to win, by the end of the game lost. Everyone had made their choice. Even the accident didn't break Daniel's pride. Who knows, maybe thanks to Kyle he could have stood up, but that would have been beyond the realm of dreams. Because men like Daniel would never reach out to men like Kyle. It's beneath their dignity. It was painful to recognize that Daniel's life had no value, as he lived only for himself. And such crazy romantics, dreamers who look like fools from the outside, are capable of moving mountains. And so ended the story of Carol and her husband. After that, the woman was never again interested in Daniel's life. He was rumored to be living with his mother. A few days later, Carol met with Kyle. The man gave her a very strange look. "So are you going to help him?" Breathlessly, he asked. For Kyle, you could say it was a matter of life and death. "No, he rejected our help," she smiled faintly. "Kyle, I don't want to talk about this anymore." "I'm all for it," he cheered. "Carol, Mom made her first cake today. She really wants you to come over for a visit." "Okay," she promised Kyle. "Tell her I'll be there." Kyle's invitation lifted her spirits. Carol worked through her day so effortlessly, as if she were being held above ground by some force. "You're glowing today," customers told her. "You're in a good mood." Carol nodded at them. She really did feel happy, as if a heavy weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The evening had been so wonderful that Carol didn't even want to go home. It seemed to her that this was where she belonged. They sat in the workshop after tea. Kyle stared at his guest. His lips moved as if he were saying something. "Carol," he said quietly. "I'm like, how do I say this?" The woman stepped closer to him and stroked his face with her hand. "I love you," Kyle finally said. "I love you too," she kissed him. "I want to be your muse," the woman whispered. "We'll do everything together. I'll help you with everything." "Thank you," he touched her hair. "Carol, I'm as lucky as Rex. I'll have not only a wife, but a friend and a companion." "I believe in you," Carol said. "You will succeed. Kyle, you're a genius. You have to admit it." "I'll try," he said timidly. "I'm not afraid of anything with you." The man breathed in the scent of her hair and couldn't believe he could be so happy. 7 years had passed. "Kyle, we're here," came from the backyard. "Are you home?" Carol headed toward her husband's huge workshop. On the way, she stopped and looked at the beautiful garden. She and Kyle had managed to find a sponsor back then after all, and Kyle had made some very good money. They had bought a 2-story house with a large lot. Amber Adams was on the first floor. She ran the garden. Carol took care of the children, but most of the time they all spent together in the lab at Dad's house. Carol gave birth to a son almost a year after she registered. And when he turned 3, they had a yearling daughter and another boy. In general, as Carol predicted, Kyle became not only a scientist but also a caring father. And despite his crazy busy schedule, he made time for his children. Now, many years later, the man was again working on the development of non-contact administration of drugs by means of special radiation. There was a businessman who invested good money in his invention. And since Kyle couldn't live without his inventions, of course he agreed. Dad, his oldest son, ran into his workshop. "We're back." "Oh," I hadn't heard his father jumped up. "How was your vacation? Did you enjoy it?" "Yes. Grandma didn't even want to get out of the pool," Oscar laughed. Why did he open his mouth in curiosity? "I'll tell you all about it later." His father took him in his arms. "Let's go to Mommy first." Her husband hugged Carol. "I see the kids are excited about the water park," he smiled. "I don't know about the kids, but I sure am." Amber Adams laughed. "I'll have something to tell you about tomorrow at work." "I wish you could have come with us." Carol touched her husband's hair. "Next time, I promise." He put his arm around her waist. "But my muse, it's time to inspire me. Mom, there's something we need to discuss in the workshop. Could you watch the kids for half an hour? I promise I'll tell you all about it tonight." He smiled as the kids puffed up their cheeks. Amber Adams stared after them. She couldn't even believe that almost 7 years ago she'd been practically unconscious. And now, thanks to her son, she could not only live a full life but make up for lost time.